Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. I thought I was just being paranoid. It was late, and the parking lot was empty, with only a few dim streetlights casting shadows between the cars. After finishing my late shift, I headed to my car, feeling the weight of exhaustion in my legs. As I walked, I noticed a man in the distance, pacing slowly between the parked cars. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just walking in circles like someone who had lost their keys. At first, I thought nothing of it, chalking it up to my tired mind playing tricks. But then, he glanced at me. His gaze lingered for a moment longer than it should have, as though he was checking to see if I was watching him. I froze for a second but quickly shook it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination running wild. The next night, the pattern repeated itself. I parked in the same spot, the same dim lights hanging overhead, the same chill in the air. But this time, when I glanced around, I noticed him again. He was standing at the far end of the parking lot, just outside the pool of light cast by the lampposts. He wasn't moving, just staring at me from a distance. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that maybe he had parked near me and was just waiting for someone. But deep down, something in my gut told me otherwise. My heart started to race as I locked my car doors and glanced nervously over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I got into my car, I kept my eyes trained on him. He didn't move, but the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I became. I turned on the ignition and began to drive slowly, hoping to make my escape. But as I passed him, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw him again. This time, he was walking directly behind my car, his pace matching mine. He wasn't even trying to hide his movements anymore. It was as if he was following me intentionally. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I sped up, my breath catching in my throat, wondering if he was somehow aware of my growing panic. Well, for the next few nights, I stayed away from that parking lot. I told myself it was just a weird coincidence, that maybe he had been just another late-night wanderer. But the unease lingered in the back of my mind. I couldn't forget how he looked at me, how his eyes seemed to study me in a way that made my skin crawl. I hoped I had imagined it all, but I knew deep down that I hadn't. It was the kind of feeling you get when something isn't quite right, like the hairs on the back of your neck standing on end. So when the weekend came and I had to work late again, I hesitated before pulling into the lot. The moment I parked, I scanned the area, my heart skipping a beat when I didn't see him at first. But then, just as I was about to get out of my car, I saw him. He was standing a few rows away, watching me. This time he wasn't pacing. He was standing still, waiting for me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out of there before something worse happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if I drove away now, it would only be the beginning. The man wasn't going to let me go that easily. I didn't want to make a scene, but I was terrified. I waited in my car for what felt like an eternity, watching the man out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move. It was like he was waiting for something, or someone, maybe even me. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The sound of my own breath felt too loud in the silence of the car. I don't remember exactly when I made the decision to leave, but I drove out of there as quickly as I could. I didn't stop at any red lights, didn't look back, and didn't even take the usual route home. I felt the man's presence lingering behind me, in the way the street lights flickered, in the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too fast. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting, that it was nothing. but I couldn't get the image of him out of my head. The way he moved, the way he watched me. There was nothing about it that felt random, and I was certain I would see him again. The house I grew up in had always been strange, but I never understood just how much until that night. I was home alone in the basement, trying to distract myself from the heavy silence that filled the house. I always felt uneasy down there, like the walls were pressing in on me, but I'd gotten used to it. I was used to the creaks of the house settling and the hum of the old furnace. It wasn't until I heard the footsteps above me that I realized something was very wrong. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate steps, the kind that made the floor shake slightly under my feet. But there was no one upstairs. The floor above me was empty. I knew because I had checked just minutes earlier. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was certain I hadn't imagined it. The footsteps were real, unmistakable. I held my breath, waiting for the sound to stop. Maybe it was just the house settling, I told myself, but I knew deep down that wasn't it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I took a tentative step toward the stairs, my eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading up. But I couldn't move. My feet felt glued to the floor, my legs trembling beneath me. The house was alive with something I couldn't explain. Then, as if the house had decided to reveal its secret, I felt that the floor beneath me shifted. It wasn't a creak or a groan like the house usually made. No, this was something different. It was as if the floorboards were moving, like something beneath the floor was pushing them upward. A sickening feeling settled in my stomach as I realized that the house itself wasn't just old, it was alive. And whatever was above me in that empty space was not of this world. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The footsteps grew louder, and I could feel them moving just above me, pacing, waiting. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound of the steps. I ran up the stairs without thinking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop to look back. As I slammed the basement door shut behind me, I felt the house settle, and I knew that whatever had been there, lurking beneath the floor, was still waiting. And I was never going back down there again. Story 2. I had just moved into a new apartment, excited for the fresh start. The place was small but cozy, a perfect fit for my budget. After weeks of searching for a new home, I was relieved to finally settle in. I unpacked quickly, eager to make the space my own, and by the time night fell, I was exhausted. The walls were still bare, the air thick with the scent of fresh paint, and everything felt calm and still. But that night, as I lay in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, I was woken by a soft but distinct knocking sound. It was rhythmic, almost purposeful, coming from the wall behind me. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, the normal creaks and groans of an old building. But then the knocking grew louder, more insistent, and my heart began to race as I sat up in bed. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to the walls in the dim light. There was no one there, but the knocking continued, now sounding almost like a message being tapped out in Morse code. I cautiously got up from the bed, walking over to the wall where the sound seemed to originate. The knocking stopped abruptly as I pressed my ear to the drywall, but the silence felt oppressive, like something was waiting just beyond the surface. I pulled away and stood in the middle of the room, listening intently. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it the wind? An animal in the walls? I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was nothing, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. There was something off about this place, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Then, without warning, a low, scraping sound came from the wall. It wasn't the soft tapping of a finger or the brushing of fabric against drywall. This was different. It was deliberate, like claws dragging across the surface, carving something into the wall. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away, my feet stumbling over the carpet. I stood frozen in the center of the room, the faint scratching sound growing louder. I grabbed my phone, flicking on the flashlight and shining it toward the wall. At first, the light revealed nothing. The wall was plain, the fresh paint unmarred. But then, as I moved the beam over the surface, I noticed faint indentations, small scratches that seemed too precise to be accidental. I reached out to touch them, my fingers brushing the cool surface. The marks were shallow but clear, as though something or someone had made them intentionally. I stared at the scratches, trying to make sense of them. The markings seemed random at first, odd symbols, numbers that didn't add up, and distorted letters that were barely legible. My head spun as I tried to interpret them, but the more I looked, the more they seemed to form a pattern. I traced my fingers along the wall, feeling a chill spread through me as I uncovered the last message. Hidden in the corner, in a place where I hadn't seen before, was a line that stood out from the rest. The message was simple but chilling. It was my full name, scratched deep into the drywall, as if someone had known me, or worse, had been watching me. The blood drained from my face as I stepped back, my hands trembling. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight, and the room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were closing in around me. How could this be? Who had done this? I rushed out of the room, my mind racing with questions. Who had been in here before me? Was there someone still here, hiding in the shadows? My thoughts spiraled out of control as I ran through the apartment, checking every room, every corner. But everything was still. The apartment was empty, just as I had left it when I moved in. Yet the message on the wall remained, an unexplainable presence that I couldn't shake. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed awake, listening to every creak and groan of the apartment. But there were no more knocks, no more scratching. The silence was deafening, but the fear lingered, gnawing at my mind. I couldn't understand it, couldn't figure out what was happening, but I knew I wasn't alone in this place. Years later, I would look back at that night, haunted by the memory of what I had found on the wall. I never did uncover who or what had left those messages. The apartment had become a distant memory, a chapter in my life I couldn't fully comprehend. But I would always remember the feeling, the cold, crawling sense of being watched, of being somehow connected to the past in a way I couldn't escape. I had spent most of my childhood in that house, and in many ways it had always been strange. The creaking floors, the cold spots in the corners, the feeling of something moving just beyond sight. I had grown used to it, though, as children often do with the oddities of their surroundings. But there was one night that forever changed the way I viewed that house. The one night that made me realize something was terribly wrong. It was late, and I was alone in the basement, sorting through old boxes that had been left behind by my parents. The basement was always dark, even with the lights on. The air was damp, thick with the smell of dust and mildew. I had grown accustomed to the stillness down there, but tonight something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one else in the house. As I bent to lift a particularly heavy box, I heard footsteps, not from downstairs or outside, but above me, coming from the floor above. The sound was unmistakable, heavy, deliberate, as if someone was walking back and forth in a room just above the basement. My heart skipped a beat. There was no upstairs. The house had only one level, with an attic that was barely large enough for storage, much less for someone to walk around in. I froze, the box still clutched in my hands, as the footsteps continued. They were slow at first, then more rapid, as though whoever or whatever was up there was moving faster, heading directly toward me. The floorboards under my feet groaned, but not in the usual way. It felt different, as though something was shifting, moving within the structure itself. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, realizing that I wasn't alone. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from above anymore. It was coming from within the walls themselves. Story 3. Late one night, I was getting ready for bed in my hotel room. After a long day of traveling, I had finally settled in, tired but relieved to be in a quiet space. The small, dimly lit room felt cozy, and I was looking forward to a good night's sleep. The bathroom was just a few steps from the bed, so I quickly made my way there to freshen up. When I finished and opened the bathroom door, something strange happened. The hallway which I had passed on my way in was no longer there. Instead of the usual wooden door leading out to the corridor, there was nothing, just smooth, bare wall where the door had been moments ago. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the spot, as if waiting for the door to reappear. I tried not to panic, thinking maybe I was just tired, and maybe I had misremembered where the door was. I walked up to the wall, feeling the coldness of it against my fingertips. But as I ran my hands along the smooth surface, I realized there was no seam, no outline, nothing to suggest a door had ever been there. It was as if the door had vanished into thin air. My heart began to race, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. The hallway had always been a few steps away. I remembered the layout of the hotel, the way the door had opened into the corridor leading to the elevator. Now all I could see was the blank wall in front of me. I backed up, hoping I had somehow missed something, but the wall stayed just as it was. Panic set in as the realization hit me I was trapped in this room with no way to escape. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe the hotel was old, and this was some kind of weird renovation or illusion. I turned to look at the window, but it was closed, and the night outside was pitch black. There was no way to know how far the hallway had stretched. It could have been hours since I had entered the bathroom, or perhaps seconds. The world outside seemed out of reach, like a different dimension that no longer existed. I tried to focus, but the longer I stood there, the more disoriented I became. My breathing grew shallow, and the silence in the room felt heavier with each passing moment. I paced in circles, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. The walls around me seemed to close in, their very presence suffocating. The longer I stood in that room, the more distant and impossible the hallway seemed. Suddenly the floor beneath me creaked. The noise wasn't loud, but it startled me, making me freeze in place. I looked down at the floor, wondering if something had shifted. But the wooden planks appeared normal, unchanged, and yet there was a feeling, a sense of movement in the air, as if the space around me was subtly rearranging itself. As I stood there, trying to steady myself, a sound echoed in the distance. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a rhythmic thudding that sounded almost like footsteps. I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from, but they seemed to echo through the walls, just beyond my reach. I knew no one else was in the room, and the thought that I might not be alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. The footsteps grew louder, and I instinctively backed away from the wall, my body tense with fear. They were coming closer now, but there was no way they could be real. The room was too small, too isolated. I had checked every corner of it when I first arrived, but still, the sound persisted, steadily approaching. The fear I felt was suffocating, the kind of fear that makes you question what's real. I forced myself to walk toward the center of the room, trying to take deep breaths, but my heart was pounding too hard to keep calm. The room felt like it was growing smaller with each step I took. I reached out, my hand trembling, touching the bare walls once more. There was no escape, no doorway, nothing but the endless blank surface that felt like it was swallowing everything around me. Then, the sound stopped. For a moment there was only silence again, but this time it was deeper, more oppressive. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind screamed for answers, but I couldn't make sense of any of it. Had the door truly disappeared? Had I imagined the footsteps? Was I losing my mind, or was something truly unnatural at work here? Just when I thought I might lose all sense of time and space, I heard another noise, a sharp, unsettling creak from above. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. It sounded like the floorboards shifting, like someone was walking overhead. I froze in place, my pulse quickening as the realization hit me with full force. There was no upstairs. I stood in the center of the room, my legs weak beneath me. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and I felt the floor beneath my feet shift, as if something was moving just below the surface. My eyes darted to the ceiling, desperate for an explanation, but there was nothing there. No one had been up there. The basement of the hotel had been sealed off for years. There was no upper floor. I backed up into the corner, pressing myself against the wall, and for the first time since I entered the room, I felt truly alone. The shifting floorboards seemed to follow me, a cruel reminder that something had changed in the space I thought I knew. There was no way out, no way to escape the nightmare that was unfolding around me. The door never returned. The hallway never appeared, and whatever was walking above me, it wasn't human. Story 4. I'd been working late at the office for months, often staying well past midnight to meet deadlines. Each night, when the building is quiet and the lights flicker slightly, I hear the whisper of my name. It's soft at first, just a faint sound in the background, but it always grows clearer the longer I stay. At first, I thought it was the stress getting to me, a trick my mind was playing due to exhaustion. But it didn't stop. Night after night, the whispering grew more insistent, and soon I couldn't ignore it. I'd be sitting at my desk, my hands on the keyboard, when I'd hear it again, a soft, almost comforting whisper, barely audible at first, but growing louder. Amanda. Each time it sent a chill down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was working too much, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Last night I decided to investigate. I sat still at my desk for a while, listening closely. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, as the clock struck 2 a.m., I heard it again, clear as day, my name. But this time it didn't feel like it was coming from the hallway or another part of the building. It was coming from behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around, but there was no one there. I stood up, my legs unsteady as I walked to the back of the office. The voice was faint now, like a breath, but I could still hear it. Amanda. I searched the room, scanning every corner, but found nothing. No one was there, yet the voice seemed to linger in the air, almost tangible, like a presence that was watching me. It wasn't until I walked to the storage closet at the far end of the office that I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. There, hidden behind a stack of old files, was a small, dusty recorder. It was an old model, the kind that you only see in forgotten corners of storage rooms. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I examined it. It was silent now, but I could still feel the weight of it in my hands, as though it was waiting for me to press play. My curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the button. A faint crackle filled the air, followed by the sound of my name whispered, soft and eerily familiar. But something was wrong. The voice on the recorder wasn't just mine. It spoke of things I'd never told anyone, private details of my life, things only I could know. It was as if the recorder had been recording my life without me realizing it. The voice on the tape wasn't just speaking my name, it was recounting memories, even those I'd long forgotten. The last words were the most chilling, "You're never alone." I dropped the recorder in shock, my breath coming in short gasps. The office, which had always seemed so familiar, suddenly felt alien. I glanced around, but there was no one there. The voice on the tape wasn't coming from any living person, yet it knew things about me that made my skin crawl. I backed away slowly, unsure of what to do. Was I losing my mind, or had someone been watching me all this time? I didn't sleep much last night. I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was still there, lurking just beyond my reach. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable. When I returned to the office today, the recorder was gone. I searched the entire room, but it had disappeared, as if it had never existed. Yet, I knew it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The voice was real, and it knew me in ways I couldn't explain. My childhood home was always strange, even when I was young. The house had an air of mystery about it, like it held secrets that no one dared to uncover. The creaky floors, the odd smells that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and the way the house always felt a few degrees colder than it should, there was something unsettling about it. But I grew used to it, and as a child I simply accepted the quirks of the house as normal. One night, many years later, I found myself back in the house, staying alone for the first time since I'd moved out. The memories of the house, once faded, came rushing back as I explored the dark, silent rooms. I wandered down to the basement, where the air was thick with dust and old memories. It was there, in the quiet, that I first heard the footsteps above me. The house was empty, there was no one upstairs. The heavy, deliberate footsteps echoed through the floorboards, slow and steady, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I froze, my heart racing. I knew the layout of the house like the back of my hand, and there was no way anyone could be up there. The sound of the footsteps continued, each step heavier than the last, until I felt the floor beneath me shift. It was as though the house itself was alive, responding to the sound. I turned to flee, but the basement door wouldn't open. The doorknob spun uselessly in my hand, as though the house was holding me inside. The floor beneath me groaned and creaked, shifting like it was moving. It felt as though the house was alive, as if it were closing in on me, trapping me in its dark, shifting depths. The footsteps above me grew louder, now joined by other sounds, scraping, dragging, as if something was moving on the floor above. Panic surged through me, and I tried again to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the room for an escape. Then, through the floorboards, I saw something. A faint crack, a hidden seam that hadn't been there before. I knelt down, pulling at the edges, and as I lifted a loose board, a cold breeze blew up from the darkness beneath the floor. What I uncovered was a hidden room, small, cold, and covered in dust. The walls were lined with old, crumbling furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved further into the room, I noticed something etched into the wall. A name. My name. And beneath it, a date, one that I didn't recognize, but that felt hauntingly familiar. The house had been waiting for me, and now that I was here, it wasn't going to let me leave. Story 5. I rented a small cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape the noise and stress of everyday life. It was the perfect retreat, quiet, isolated, and surrounded by nature. The air smelled fresh, and the rustling of leaves seemed to whisper in the distance. As I settled in, the cabin felt like a refuge from everything I was trying to leave behind. The first evening passed without incident, the crackling of the fireplace keeping me company as I sipped on tea and read a book. I explored the surrounding woods during the day, enjoying the peace, but something felt off as the night fell. I went to bed early, thinking the isolation was simply making me anxious, but the feeling of being watched lingered just beyond my awareness. The next morning, I tried to leave the cabin, but when I reached for the door handle, I found it was locked from the outside. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but I tried again and again, the door stubbornly refusing to open. My heart began to race as I checked the windows sealed tight with no way of escaping. I couldn't fathom how this was possible. I tried to stay calm and considered other exits, though the cabin was small and simple. It had no back door or other entrances that I could see. But then I noticed something strange, a door that I didn't remember seeing before. It was on the far side of the cabin, tucked away behind a heavy curtain. The door appeared to be old, its wood warped and covered in dust, as if it had been forgotten for years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door. The knob turned easily, almost too easily, as if it had been recently oiled. Stepping inside, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. There was nothing particularly unusual about it at first glance, just old furniture covered in sheets, a dusty lamp, and some cobwebs. But when I looked closer, something stopped me cold. The walls were covered in words, hastily scrawled across the peeling paint. "Help me," the words repeated, seemingly endless, and they were written in what appeared to be dried blood. My mind raced as I backed out of the room, wondering if someone had been trapped here before me. The message seemed to pulse with a kind of urgency, like a cry for help from the past. I searched the room for any signs of the person who might have written the message, but there was nothing, no furniture, no items left behind, just the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. The air in the room was thick and cold, and as I stood there, I felt a chill run down my spine. Something in the house, something in the very walls was aware of my presence. Suddenly, the sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the cabin. I rushed out of the room, my heart pounding. But the door was still locked, and the cabin had taken on an even more oppressive atmosphere. The silence was suffocating, and I knew I had to find a way out before whatever was trapped here reached out for me. I turned back to the forgotten room, feeling an unexplainable pull toward it. Perhaps there was something I missed, some clue hidden in the room that could explain the cryptic message on the walls. But as I stepped back inside, the air grew heavier, as if the room itself was swallowing me whole. The feeling of being watched became overwhelming, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved deeper into the room. I could hear something, whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. The words seemed to call out to me, pleading for something, but I couldn't understand. I had to get out, I told myself, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me, and I was plunged into darkness. The whispers grew louder, frantic, as if they were all around me, closing in. The feeling of suffocation intensified, and I could barely breathe. I groped for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Something cold, something ancient seemed to be pressing down on me, and I could feel the walls closing in. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually the door opened on its own, and I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. The cabin felt different now, darker, heavier, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I ran to the front door again, but it was still locked, and no matter how hard I tried, it refused to open. I collapsed to the floor, my mind spinning. The room, the message on the walls, the whispers, it was all too much. I had to find a way to escape. The realization dawned on me with a sickening clarity. The cabin wasn't just a place to hide, it was a trap, and I had walked right into it. Whatever was waiting in that room was still here, and it wasn't letting me leave. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the rising panic, but the whispers were still there, echoing through my thoughts, telling me that I would never leave, that the cabin would keep me forever. When I opened my eyes, I saw it again, the door to the forgotten room, now wide open, inviting me back in. And for a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered if I would ever be able to leave, or if I was already part of the story written on those walls. Story 6. I was home alone for the weekend, and at first everything felt fine. The house was quiet, still, almost too peaceful. After a few hours, I began to hear faint tapping on my bedroom window. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, a stray branch brushing against the glass. But the noise came every night, almost rhythmically, as if someone was waiting. The tapping grew louder each time, and it started to feel deliberate, persistent. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the house settling. But each night, it got harder to push the unease away. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I forced myself to get out of bed and approach the window, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally mustered the courage to peek outside, I could see nothing at first. The night was dark, the yard bathed in shadows. But then I saw a shadowy figure standing still, just beyond the edge of the porch. It was tall, motionless, like it was waiting for something. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. There was no mistaking it, it was a person, and they were staring directly at me. I quickly pulled away from the window, my hands trembling as I backed away. The figure remained where it was, unmoving, as if it had been there for hours. My mind raced with questions. Who could it be? Why hadn't they moved? And then panic set in. I scrambled for my phone to call the police, but when I glanced back out the window, the figure was gone. The night outside was as still and empty as it had been before. Just when I thought I could breathe again, the tapping started again. It was coming from the other side of the room now, louder and sharper. My heart began to race. How could the figure have moved so quickly? I looked around the room, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sign of anyone. The window remained dark, and there was no sound from outside. I couldn't bring myself to look again, but the tapping persisted. It was as if it were trying to draw my attention, to pull me back to the window. My entire body was frozen, caught between the need to know and the deep, gut-wrenching fear that if I looked again, I wouldn't like what I saw. Each tap against the glass felt like a hammer driving the fear deeper into my chest. The tapping didn't stop. I couldn't keep track of time, but it felt like hours passed before I heard the unmistakable sound of something scratching at the window. It was slow, deliberate, as if whatever was outside was testing the glass. That's when I realized something even worse. The tapping wasn't random. It was in rhythm, like someone's deliberate effort to let me know they were right outside. The dread that had settled deep within me turned to terror, and I found myself paralyzed. What was out there? Who was out there? The last thing I wanted to do was look again, but I knew I had to. I couldn't live in this terror, in the unknown. My hand, still shaking, crept toward the window. The moment I lifted the curtain, the tapping stopped, but I saw nothing. The night outside was completely still again. The figure was gone. My childhood home was always strange. It had an old, creaky charm, with hidden corners and narrow hallways that seemed to breathe with the house. I had spent years in that house, learning to love the creaks and groans of its settling floors, the sounds that had once comforted me. But all of that changed one night when I was home alone in the basement. That night, the house felt different. I had been sitting in the basement for hours, working on an old project when I first heard the sound. At first, it was nothing but a soft thud, like a door closing in another part of the house. But then it came again, louder this time. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The sound was unmistakable footsteps, but there was no one else in the house. The basement was the lowest part, and I knew for a fact that there were no other floors above me. I stood up slowly, trying to make sense of the sound. It was heavy, deliberate, the sound of boots scraping against the floor. The kind of steps you would hear on wood, but the floor in the basement was concrete. As the sound grew louder, the air seemed to grow heavier, thick with a cold I hadn't noticed before. I stood motionless, straining to hear, trying to determine the direction. But there was no upstairs, no room above me. I was alone in the basement, or so I thought. Then the floor beneath me shifted. I could feel it beneath my feet, the boards creaking and groaning as though they were alive. The ground buckled slightly, and I felt a sharp jolt, as though something or someone was moving above me, just beyond the walls. My breath quickened, and I instinctively backed away, my mind spinning. What could cause the floor to shift like that? The footsteps were getting closer now, louder, heavier. I took a hesitant step forward, peering around the dim light of the basement. The sounds continued, growing in intensity. I scanned the room, the corners of the basement filled with shadows that seemed to move just outside my vision. There was no one there. There couldn't be anyone there. And yet the footsteps grew closer. The ground beneath me continued to shift, and I realized, with growing terror, that something was in the house with me. It wasn't just the footsteps. The house had shifted, the floor had moved, and I could feel something in the air. A presence, as if the house itself was breathing. I wanted to run, to escape, but the very foundation seemed to be closing in on me. My legs felt like lead as I slowly crept toward the stairs. But the shifting beneath me grew louder, closer. The thing in the house wasn't bound by the same rules of space. It was something else, something that had been waiting. I took one last look around the basement, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. There was no longer any doubt in my mind. I wasn't alone. The thing that had been walking above me wasn't above me at all. It was right here, in the room with me. Story 7. I woke up to the sound of a knock on the door. It was early, and the sun had barely begun to rise. I stumbled out of bed, confused, wondering who could possibly be at my door at this hour. As I opened it, I found a brown package sitting on the doorstep. No return address, no markings, just a plain, unassuming package staring back at me. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with questions. Who would leave something like this without identifying themselves? I bent down and picked up the package. It was light, almost too light for the size. My fingers trembled slightly as I tore off the wrapping, revealing a small, old-fashioned photograph. The image was of my house, taken from the street at night. I immediately recognized the porch light glowing in the picture, the shadows stretching across the driveway, and the tree in the front yard swaying in the breeze. It was all so familiar, so ordinary, and yet something about it made my skin crawl. I turned it over, hoping for some clue as to who had sent it, but the back was blank. Inside the package, along with the photograph, there was a note. My heart sank as I read the simple, chilling message written in bold, almost hurried script. I've been watching you. The words were so direct, so unsettling, that I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My first instinct was to laugh it off. It could be a prank, right? But the photograph didn't feel like a joke. It felt too real, too personal. How could someone have taken that photo? Who would go through the trouble of leaving it on my doorstep with such an ominous message? I looked around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but the street was empty. There was no one in sight, and the quiet of the morning made the whole situation feel even more surreal. I held the photograph in my hands, feeling its weight, wondering how much I really knew about the people in my neighborhood. I had never seen anyone unusual around here, and yet somehow, someone knew where I lived. They knew how my house looked at night. They had been watching me. I took the photo back inside, still feeling the heavy weight of the message. It wasn't just the fact that someone had seen my house at night. It was the feeling that they had been watching me. I couldn't shake the image of someone standing out there in the dark, waiting, observing. I thought about the times I had been alone at night, walking around the house, unaware that someone might have been standing just outside, watching. I couldn't remember anything strange happening, but what if it had? What if I had missed something? The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went about my routine, but I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, the note. It gnawed at the back of my mind. I checked the locks on the doors and windows just to be sure. Each time I walked past a window, I glanced outside, expecting to see someone standing in the distance. But there was nothing. Still, the unease lingered. Whoever had sent the package knew things about me that I hadn't told anyone. There was no way this was a coincidence. That night, I stayed up later than usual, listening to the silence of the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside sent me into a state of alert. I kept the lights on, hoping that the bright glow would chase away the unease that had settled over me. But the shadows felt closer than usual, as if they were stretching just beyond the reach of the light. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but the knot in my stomach tightened with every passing hour. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the events in my head over and over. Who was watching me? Why had they sent the package? Was it a threat, or was it just some sick joke? My thoughts raced, each question leading to more uncertainty. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, something I couldn't see but could feel in the pit of my stomach. It was as if the very air in the house had changed, had grown heavier, more oppressive. The next morning I went out to the porch again, hoping that maybe it had all been a bad dream. But when I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The ground near the door was disturbed, as if someone had been standing there, shifting their weight back and forth. There were no footprints, but the dirt around the edges of the porch had been slightly scuffed, as though someone had been pacing. My heart raced, and I quickly retreated back inside. The feeling of being watched never left. Each time I looked out a window, I felt as though someone was out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to make a move. The house that once felt like a safe haven now felt like a prison, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was always one step ahead. The photograph sat on my kitchen counter, a constant reminder of the message, of the person who knew more about me than they should. Every day I thought about calling the police, but something held me back. What could I say? That someone had sent me a photograph and a note. It sounded absurd. As the days wore on, the unease only grew. The package, the photo, and the note had been just the beginning. Each new moment brought with it the crushing realization that I wasn't alone, not in the way I thought. Something was watching me, and I had no idea how to make it go. Story 8. I had just moved into a new apartment in the quiet part of town, eager to start fresh and leave behind the noise and chaos of my old life. The building itself was old, but it had a certain charm, with creaky floors and windows that let in the warm afternoon sun. The neighbors were mostly quiet, and I was excited to settle in. One evening, as I was unpacking, my neighbor, Claire, knocked on my door with a smile and a plate of homemade cookies. She seemed warm and welcoming, so I invited her in, happy to have some human interaction after the long day. We sat down in my modest living room, chatting about the building and the neighborhood. She was pleasant, sharing stories about the previous tenants and offering advice about local spots to check out. As she spoke, my attention kept drifting to the walls. They were covered with photographs of me. I couldn't believe it at first. There were pictures of me as a child, at my old job, and even recent ones of me walking down the street just yesterday. I wasn't sure how to react, so I forced a smile and pretended I didn't notice. "Do you like them?" Claire asked, her voice cheerful but with an edge of something I couldn't quite place. I wasn't sure how to answer. How could I like something so unsettling? It wasn't just one or two pictures, either. Every wall, from floor to ceiling, was filled with photographs of me. It felt like she had been following me for years, capturing my every move. I suddenly felt trapped in her gaze, as if the walls were closing in around me. I tried to steady my breathing, unsure of what to say. How did you get these?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. Claire's eyes sparkled with a strange intensity, and she leaned back in her chair, as if savoring the moment. "I've always been interested in you," she said, almost too casually. "I wanted you to feel at home here, so I thought I'd give you something special." Her words hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I felt a chill sweep over me, despite the warm room. It was as if I had stepped into a nightmare, that there was no escape. The photographs were everywhere, too many to ignore, each one more unsettling than the last. I had to get out of there. I stood abruptly, my heart pounding in my chest. "I think I need to go," I said, my voice shaky. Claire didn't seem surprised. She simply nodded and smiled, as though she had been expecting me to leave all along. "Of course," she said, her voice dripping with sweetness. "You'll be back soon though, right?" I didn't answer, turning quickly and walking out of her apartment. The door closed behind me with a soft click, and I was left standing in the hallway, my mind racing with questions I didn't want answers to. That night, as I lay in bed, the images of Claire's apartment haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Claire was always there, just behind the walls. I wondered how long she had been following me, how she had gotten all those pictures. There was no logical explanation, and yet everything about the encounter felt wrong, like I had stumbled into a web I couldn't escape from. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and every creak of the building made me jump. The next few days passed in a blur, and I tried to avoid Claire as much as possible, but her presence lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I kept my curtains tightly drawn, and I didn't leave the apartment unless I absolutely had to. It wasn't just the photographs that bothered me, it was the way Claire looked at me, as if she knew everything about me, even things I hadn't told anyone. It was as if she had been following me long before I ever set foot in the building. One evening, a few days later, I found myself back in my childhood home. I had gone to visit my parents for the weekend, hoping to find some peace of mind. But even there, in the place I had once felt safe, something didn't feel right. It was an old house, creaky and worn, with a history of strange noises that I had always brushed off as the house settling. I had spent years convincing myself that the odd sounds like footsteps from the floor above, when there was no one, they were just figments of my imagination. But that night, alone in the basement, I began to wonder if there was something more. I was folding laundry when I first heard it, heavy, deliberate footsteps, slow and dragging, coming from above. I froze. There was no one else in the house. My parents were upstairs, fast asleep. The house was old, but there should have been no reason for anyone to be walking around in the upper rooms. I slowly stood up, my heart beginning to race, and made my way to the stairs. My hand gripped the railing, and I glanced nervously at the ceiling, wondering if I had somehow imagined it. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I stood still, holding my breath. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt a chill run through me. There was no upstairs. The floor above me should have been empty, and yet the footsteps continued, unmistakable and growing more urgent. The sound of them reverberated through the house, almost as if someone was walking directly above me, dragging their feet across the floor. I glanced down at the basement floor, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw the board shift. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The floor was moving, shifting beneath my feet. Something or someone was in the house, and I wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I stood paralyzed with fear. I had no idea what was happening, only that the house, my childhood home, was not what I thought it was. The footsteps didn't stop, and I didn't know if I wanted to find out who or what was causing them, or if I should just run as fast as I could. Story 9. I was driving home alone on an empty highway late at night, the kind of quiet that only comes when the world is asleep. The headlights from my car illuminated the road ahead, casting long shadows on either side. The radio played softly in the background, the only sound breaking the silence of the vast, open stretch of road. It had been a long day at work, and I was eager to get home, curl up in bed, and forget the stresses of the day. As I cruised along, I noticed the headlights of another car in my rearview mirror, just a bit too close for comfort. At first, I thought it was just another driver, maybe someone else headed home from a late shift, but the car didn't pull ahead or change lanes. Instead, it stayed right behind me, its lights shining bright and constant, matching my speed exactly. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat and glanced at the rearview mirror again, trying to make out anything about the driver. I sped up slightly, hoping that would make the car back off. But no matter how fast I went, the other car remained right behind me, its headlights still glaring like eyes staring at me through the dark. I could feel a tightness in my chest, the kind that comes when you know something is wrong but can't explain why. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I glanced around. No other cars were on the road, no exits or gas stations to pull off at, just endless blackness and the hum of my engine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The driver's face, pale, emotionless, and staring directly at me, was visible through the rearview mirror. The face wasn't moving, just locked in place, staring without blinking. The shock of it hit me like a jolt of electricity. I wasn't imagining it, the face was real, and it wasn't the face of a normal person. I could feel the weight of that gaze on me, like I was being watched by something that shouldn't be there. Panic set in, and I pressed down harder on the accelerator. The car behind me matched my speed effortlessly. The face remained unchanged, locked in a haunting, vacant stare. I could feel my heart racing, the quiet hum of the highway becoming drowned out by the rapid thumping of my pulse. The more I tried to distance myself from the car, the closer it seemed to get. I wasn't just being tailgated anymore, I was being hunted. I could feel the air in the car becoming thick, suffocating. Every few seconds I dared to look in the rearview mirror again, hoping the car would be gone, but it was always there. The driver's face never moved, never showed any sign of emotion, just that unsettling, blank stare. My hands were trembling on the wheel, and my foot was pressed so hard on the gas pedal I could barely feel my foot anymore. The road stretched on endlessly in front of me, and I realized with a chilling certainty that I was trapped. With a deep breath, I glanced to the side, looking for some kind of escape, a turnoff, a rest stop, anything. But the highway stretched on, dark and empty, with no signs of life. I turned back to the rearview mirror and saw the car was closer now. I couldn't remember when it had gotten so close, but it was as if the other car was no longer behind me, but inside my very mind. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine, the presence of the other car overwhelming. I was no longer alone. Alone. A sudden thought crossed my mind. What if I stopped? What if I just pulled over and let the other car pass? The idea made my stomach churn. I couldn't bear the thought of the other driver seeing my face, locking eyes with me. My foot slammed harder on the accelerator, pushing the car faster, but the headlights behind me seemed to increase in intensity, as if urging me to go faster still. The road was still endless, my speed still futile. No matter what I did, that car would not let me escape. My vision began to blur with anxiety, and the world around me seemed to narrow down to nothing but the sound of the engine and the blinding lights behind me. I had no idea how much time had passed or how long I had been driving, but my eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror now, unable to look away. There was a moment when the car's headlights flashed brightly, like a warning or a signal. In that instant, I saw something I had not noticed before. The car didn't have any license plates. I slammed my foot on the brake, desperate to stop, to get away, to somehow make this nightmare end. The car behind me did the same, as though it was mimicking my every move. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping it would pass me, but the headlights never flickered, never showed any sign of slowing down. The eerie, emotionless face of the driver grew larger in the mirror, as if the space between us was shrinking. The last thing I remember before I passed out from fear was seeing the driver's face in full view, a pale, hollow figure with eyes that seemed to see straight into my soul. And then everything went black. The house I grew up in always had a strange energy to it, but I never thought much of it until that night. It was late, and I was the only one home. Everyone else had gone out, leaving me alone to do the usual evening chores in the basement. The basement was always cold, even on the warmest of days, and the low, creaky floorboards seemed to echo with sounds that didn't belong. I'd grown used to the weird creaks and groans, dismissing them as the house settling, but that night something felt different. I was folding laundry, the sound of the fabric rustling filling the empty space, when I first heard it. A heavy step, like someone walking above me. But there was no one above me, just the dark, empty floors. I froze, my heart racing as I listened, hoping it was just a trick of the house settling. A draft making the floors creak. But then there was another step, this one heavier, closer, as if someone was pacing above me. The air around me seemed to grow colder, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. I slowly stood up, my breath shallow, and took a few hesitant steps towards the stairs that led up to the main floor. The steps continued, each one growing louder and more distinct. They were heavy, purposeful. I had never heard anything like it before. The house was old, but it wasn't that old. I could feel the floor beneath my feet shifting, as if the very foundation was moving. I turned to look around the basement, hoping to see something that would make sense of the noise. But there was nothing. The footsteps were getting closer. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone. I felt an icy chill spread through my veins, and the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer, and more frantic, as if whatever was making them was now right above me. My mind raced. I knew there was no one upstairs, no one else home. My thoughts scattered as I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The floorboards creaked underfoot, shifting unnaturally as the steps seemed to move in unison with my panic. I was trapped. I was trapped. I tried to run, but the heavy footsteps followed me, relentless, the sound thundering in the basement as though something or someone was hunting me. The house wasn't mine anymore. It never had been. Story 10. My childhood home was always strange. It wasn't just old. There was something unsettling about the way the walls seemed to close in on you, like they were watching. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, felt like a whisper of something just beyond comprehension. I'd grown used to it, though. I thought I had, anyway. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I was alone in the basement. It was an ordinary evening, or so I thought. My parents were out, and I was downstairs in the basement, searching through old boxes of junk that had accumulated over the years. The smell of dust hung thick in the air, and the single light bulb overhead flickered occasionally, casting strange shadows on the walls. The basement was a place I'd always avoided, but tonight I felt oddly compelled to be there, like the house itself was pulling me into its depths. I was crouched over a box of old books when I first heard it. A sound, muffled at first, that came from above. It wasn't a door creaking, or the house settling like I'd expected. No, this was something else, something distinct. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing directly above me. My breath caught in my throat. There was no upstairs. The house was a single story, and the attic was sealed shut, unused for years. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. But then the steps came again, heavier this time, closer to the ground. I scanned the ceiling above me, my mind racing. The floorboards groaned in response to my every movement, as though they too were aware of something I was not. The house was old, but not old enough to have hidden rooms or secret passageways. The footsteps, though, were unmistakable. I could feel them under my feet, vibrating through the wooden floor, each step more deliberate than the last. I backed away slowly, my legs stiff with fear, my heartbeat quickening. What in the world could it be? As I edged closer to the stairs, the strange sensation of the floor beneath me shifted. It wasn't just the normal creak of old wood. The floor seemed to buckle, just slightly, as though something was moving beneath it. I stepped back, my heart in my throat, and the scraping sound came again. It was faint, but it was there. Something was dragging across the floor. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me with a wave of nausea. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more suffocating. The house had never felt so alive, as if it had a heartbeat of its own, and I could feel it in the floorboards under my feet. My hand hovered over the doorknob of the stairs, and just as I was about to turn it, the air grew thick, like the pressure was building. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the shadows in the corners of the room. A chill settled over my skin, and the light above flickered again, casting strange patterns on the floor. I felt a cold rush of wind at my back, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something wasn't right, and every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to leave this place and never return. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to move. The floor creaked once more, louder now. The scraping sound was more distinct, more deliberate, like something was trying to break through. Then I heard it, a low whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A voice. It was muffled and distorted, like it was coming from behind a wall, and then it called my name. My stomach churned, and I froze, unable to move, unable to scream. The voice was coming from above, from the very place where the footsteps had been. I knew then that whatever was here wasn't a figment of my imagination. There was something in the house, something that had been hiding, waiting. I stumbled backward, away from the stairs, my legs shaking beneath me. My eyes were locked on the ceiling, terrified of what I might see if I looked away for even a second. The whispering stopped, but the silence left a lingering pressure, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, the floor beneath me groaned again. This time it wasn't just a creak. It was as if the entire foundation of the house was shifting, as though the very ground I stood on was alive, reacting to something below. I gasped, my mind spinning with fear, and then I heard it again, the voice, clearer this time and much closer. It was almost in my ear now. "Come closer," it whispered, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was low, guttural, distorted, and wrong. My pulse thundered in my ears. Without thinking, I turned and bolted up the stairs, my feet pounding against the steps. My hands fumbled with the door at the top of the stairs, but it wouldn't open. I yanked harder, panic seizing me, until finally it gave way. I burst into the kitchen, breathless, and slammed the door behind me, my heart still racing. The house was silent again, but I knew it wasn't over. The footsteps, the voice, the shifting floorboards, they were still there, just waiting, watching. I wasn't alone in that house, and I didn't know if I ever would be again. Story 11. It was around 2 a.m. when the phone rang. The sharp, persistent sound cut through the stillness of the night, dragging me out of a deep sleep. My heart raced as I fumbled to grab the phone, my mind still foggy from the abrupt awakening. When I answered, I was greeted by nothing but frantic gasping, the kind of panic breath that only comes when someone is in serious distress. The voice on the other end was shaky, struggling to form coherent words, but the fear in it was unmistakable. "Help, help me," the voice pleaded, barely audible through the rapid, irregular breathing. I sat up, instantly wide awake now, my pulse pounding in my ears. My first thought was that it was a wrong number or a prank, but there was something unsettling about the voice that made me hesitate. It wasn't just the panic, it was how familiar it sounded. I strained to listen, trying to make sense of the gasp, but all I could hear was an urgent, desperate cry for help. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The response I got sent a chill down my spine. "I don't know. Please, it's coming for me. It's right behind me." I was frozen for a moment, my mind racing to comprehend what was happening. Who was this person, and why did their voice sound so much like mine? The words made no sense, but the fear was all too real. I tried to stay calm, pushing aside the creeping dread that crawled up my spine. "Where are you calling from?" I repeated, my voice firmer this time, though my insides felt like they were unraveling. The voice gasped again, the sound of shuffling footsteps barely audible in the background, like someone or something was moving in the darkness. "It's your address, please, it's too late." I grabbed my jacket, a sense of urgency flooding over me. There was no time to waste. I knew this address, knew it well. It was my own. The panic in my chest intensified as the voice on the other end let out a final, gut-wrenching scream, before the line suddenly went dead. I was left staring at the phone, the silence now deafening. My hands shook as I tried to process what had just happened. Was it a prank? A cruel joke? Or was it something else, something far worse? I didn't hesitate for long. I grabbed my keys and rushed out the door, the cold air biting at my skin as I jumped into my car. The drive was a blur, my mind consumed by the unnerving call. The thought that someone who sounded exactly like me was in danger in my own home made my stomach turn. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities, but I couldn't bring myself to entertain any of them. I had to get there, had to make sure everything was all right. When I arrived at my house, it was eerily quiet. The lights were off, and the front door stood slightly ajar. A sense of dread washed over me as I stepped out of the car and approached the house. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest as I pushed the door open. The interior was dark, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding hollow in the silence. There was no response, only the faint creaking of floorboards above me. I took a step inside, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in around me. The house seemed so much bigger at night, every shadow stretching unnaturally long. My breath caught in my throat as I made my way through the hallway. the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that there was something or someone watching me. I reached the living room and froze. There, sitting on the couch, was me. The same clothes, the same face, the same expression of terror. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as I stared at myself. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. My reflection, or whatever this was, wasn't moving, its eyes wide with fear, its hands trembling. I took a step forward, my voice barely a whisper as I called out to it. What is this? The figure on the couch jerked, its head snapping toward me. It wasn't me anymore. The fear in its eyes was replaced with something darker, something cold. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The figure stood up, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. My breath hitched as I realized the horror of what was happening. The thing that looked like me took a step forward, its lips pulling into a twisted smile. The smile wasn't mine, though. It was a grotesque, mocking version of it, like it was trying to imitate me but had failed in the most horrifying way. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing as I backed away from the thing. It moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine, its smile widening. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered in a voice that was eerily familiar, but still not mine. I ran. My feet pounded against the floor as I rushed toward the door, my mind screaming at me to get out. The thing's laughter echoed behind me, cold and hollow, as if it was enjoying my fear. I burst through the door and into the night, the cold air filling my lungs. My hands shook as I fumbled to lock the door behind me, but I couldn't shake the image of it. The thing that had taken my place. I didn't know what it wanted, or how it was even possible. But as I stood there in the quiet night, the phone call replaying in my mind, one thing was certain. Whatever that thing was, it was still in my house wearing my face, and it wasn't going anywhere. Story 12. It was a typical evening when I first noticed my keys were missing. I had been home all day, moving from room to room, but when it came time to leave for an appointment, I realized my keys weren't where I usually kept them. I retraced my steps through the house, checking every nook and cranny. I went through my coat pockets, my bag, and every surface in the living room, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt. After searching for what felt like hours, I started to panic. I checked every room again, opening drawers and looking under furniture. I even checked the bathroom, despite knowing I hadn't been in there. My anxiety grew as the minutes passed, and the thought of being locked out of my house made me feel trapped. I was sure I hadn't gone anywhere outside today. They couldn't have disappeared without reason. I was about to give up when I decided to try one last place, the kitchen. I walked in, thinking that maybe I had set them down there without realizing it. The moment I entered, I felt a strange chill in the air, even though the house was warm. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as I stepped toward the counter, I saw the keys lying on the kitchen table. Relieved to finally have found them, I picked them up, but immediately I froze. They were coated in a sticky, viscous substance, almost like sap, but darker in color. The keys were speckled with it, and the texture was strangely unnatural. I wiped them on a towel, but the substance wouldn't come off. My mind raced, and I couldn't make sense of it. How had they gotten like this? I hadn't spilled anything in the kitchen, and I couldn't imagine how something like this could have happened. I stood there for a moment, holding the keys in my hand, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe it was just some weird residue from the counter, or perhaps it was a mistake I'd made earlier in the day. But something about it didn't sit right with me, and my unease grew the longer I stared at the keys. It didn't feel like a random spill. It felt intentional, like they had been placed there for a reason. After cleaning the keys as best I could, I went about my evening, though I couldn't shake the strange feeling that something was off. My mind kept returning to the sticky substance, wondering if I had missed something during my earlier search. I kept thinking about the odd sensation I had felt in the kitchen, as if the air itself had been different. I couldn't put it into words, but something had felt wrong, like an invisible presence had been in the house. The next morning, I ran into my neighbor while leaving for work. He was standing outside, watering his plants, and waved when he saw me. I waved back and started to walk past him, but he called out, asking if I was okay. His tone was strange, like he had something on his mind but wasn't sure whether to say it. I stopped and turned to face him. "Yeah, I'm fine. Why do you ask?" He hesitated, looking around as if making sure no one else was around. "I don't mean to freak you out, but I saw something strange last night." He looked at me closely, his eyes filled with concern. "I saw a man standing near your front door after dark. He seemed to be trying to get inside." I blinked, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean trying to get inside?" My neighbor shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't see him clearly, but he was standing right by your front door, pacing back and forth. I thought maybe he was waiting for you, but then I saw him try the door handle, like he was trying to open it. He looked out of place, like he didn't belong here." I stood there, trying to process what he was saying. My neighbor wasn't the type to exaggerate, and his expression was serious. A cold chill ran down my spine, and I suddenly remembered the strange feeling I had had in the kitchen the night before. Could it be connected? Had someone really tried to break into my house? I didn't think much of it at the time, my neighbor continued. "But now that you mention the keys, I don't know. It just seemed off." I felt a wave of nausea rise in my stomach. The pieces were starting to come together in a way that made no sense. The keys, the sticky substance, the odd chill in the air the night before, it all seemed connected. But how? Why would someone try to break into my house? And why would they leave my keys coated in some strange residue behind? I thanked my neighbor, though I felt a sense of dread settling over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was more sinister than I had realized. Had the man been watching me? Had he been waiting for me to leave? Or was there something else going on that I didn't understand? My mind raced with questions, but there were no answers, only more uncertainty. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, unable to focus on anything. I couldn't stop thinking about what my neighbor had said. What had he seen? Who had been trying to get into my house? And what was the meaning of the sticky substance on the keys? I couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was watching me. The house, which had always felt like home, now felt like a place of uncertainty, where the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, and the air felt just a little too thick. By the time I got home that evening, I had made a decision. I would take extra precautions from now on. I would keep the doors locked at all times and set up cameras outside to monitor any unusual activity. But despite all my plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened that night, and whatever had left the strange substance on my keys, was far from over. Something was out there, and I was just beginning to realize the extent of what it wanted. Story 13. I had always dreamed of living in a quiet, peaceful place away from the noise of the city. When I found an old house out in the country, it seemed perfect. The house was surrounded by tall trees, and the air was fresh and clean. There was something serene about the place, and I imagined how wonderful it would be to settle down in such an isolated spot, free from the distractions of urban life. When I first moved in, everything seemed fine. The rooms were spacious, The wooden floors creaked under my feet in a comforting way, and the windows let in plenty of natural light. It was an old house, no doubt, but it had charm. I spent the first few days unpacking and getting used to the place, enjoying the peace and quiet that came with it. It was a stark contrast to the constant hustle and bustle I had left behind. But soon I began to notice something odd. Every time I tried to turn on the TV or the radio, there was no sound. I checked the connections, made sure everything was plugged in, but no matter what I did, the static on the screen or the silence from the speakers persisted. I thought maybe it was an issue with the electricity or the appliances themselves. Still, when I tried the other devices in the house, everything seemed fine. Lights worked, the stove was functional, and the refrigerator hummed with life. I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that grew inside me. Maybe it was just the old wiring, or some quirk of the house that I wasn't used to yet. But as the days passed, the silence seemed to grow heavier. I tried reading or listening to music, but it was as if the house absorbed all sound, as though it was somehow designed to keep everything quiet. It was a strange and suffocating atmosphere, one that made me feel disconnected from the world outside. One evening I decided to go for a walk to clear my mind. The wind rustled the leaves on the trees, but when I returned to the house, something felt different. The quietness that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a presence, something oppressive that surrounded me at all times. As I walked inside, I tried once more to turn on the radio, but it was the same nothing but dead air. That's when I started to notice something even stranger: the windows. The curtains were always drawn, and I never thought much about it. But as I walked past one of them, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow. At first I thought it was just the way the light shifted, but then I saw it again. The faint outline of something moving outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I pulled the curtains open, but there was no one there. The yard was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a trick of the light, or perhaps a bird had flown by. But every time I walked past a window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just not used to the isolation. Still, I couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that something was wrong. I began to check the windows more frequently, but there was never anyone there. It wasn't just the windows that bothered me, it was the feeling of being completely alone, surrounded by the silence. I would try to make noise to break the stillness, but nothing ever seemed to fill the space. The house seemed to swallow up all sound, like it was somehow sealed off from the world. It was as if the walls themselves were absorbing the vibrations, trapping me in a cocoon of silence. The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel trapped. The isolation started to wear on me. I couldn't even get the sound of a radio or TV to keep me company. It felt as if the house was intentionally keeping me in a bubble, detached from the world outside. But it wasn't just the lack of noise, it was the feeling of being watched that started to gnaw at me. Every time I walked past the windows, the sensation grew stronger. Someone was out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a move. But who? And why? One evening, unable to stand it any longer, I decided to investigate. I pulled open the curtains of the largest window in the living room and peered outside. At first, I saw nothing but the darkened yard and the distant outline of the trees. But then I saw a faint shape in the shadows. It was just barely visible, but it was unmistakable. Someone was standing just beyond the tree line, partially hidden by the thick brush. My blood ran cold. I quickly stepped back from the window, my heart racing. I had no idea who it was or what they wanted, but I knew I wasn't alone. The house had been silent, yes, but that didn't mean I had been alone all this time. Someone had been watching me from the shadows, and I had never even known it. The next few days were a blur. I stayed inside, never venturing too far from the house. The silence pressed in on me from all sides, suffocating, almost like the house was alive, breathing around me. I stopped checking the windows, too afraid to face what I had seen. The sensation of being watched never left, and each day it grew stronger, more palpable. I couldn't escape the feeling that the house had been designed for this, that it was built with one purpose, to trap me in its silence, to watch me without my knowing. And somewhere, just outside my window, someone or something was always watching, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The stillness that had once seemed peaceful now felt like a prison, and I couldn't find a way out. Story 14. It was a warm afternoon, the kind that invited children to play outside until the sun dipped below the horizon. My friends and I had gathered for an afternoon game of hide and seek at my house, a place we'd all spent countless hours together. The house was old, with creaky floorboards and shadowy corners that always seemed to hide something mysterious. I knew every inch of it, and for that reason I always considered myself the best at hiding. This time I chose the attic. The stairs creaked under my feet as I made my way up to the top, my heart racing with the thrill of escaping being found. The attic was a perfect hiding place, dark, cluttered with old furniture, and filled with forgotten relics of the past. I squeezed myself behind a dusty, moth-eaten rug that hung from the wall, trying to stay as still as possible. The only sounds were the muffled voices of my friends below and the occasional rattle of a window in the breeze. As the minutes stretched on, I grew bored of waiting to be discovered. My eyes wandered around the attic, searching for anything interesting to distract me. It wasn't long before I spotted an old, wooden trunk tucked away in a far corner, almost completely obscured by a pile of boxes. The trunk looked ancient, its edges worn and chipped, and its brass lock tarnished with age. Something about it drew me in. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I just needed to move, but I crawled out from behind the rug and slowly approached the trunk. I knelt beside it, the air in the attic thick with dust. My fingers traced the edges of the lock, but to my surprise, it wasn't locked. The latch gave way with a faint creak as I lifted the lid, and an overwhelming smell hit me, old, musty, like something had been sealed away for far too long. I hesitated, suddenly aware that I was doing something I probably shouldn't. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I peered inside. The sight I saw made my stomach lurch. The trunk wasn't filled with clothes or old toys like I had imagined. Instead, it contained something far worse, a bundle wrapped in what appeared to be a faded blanket. At first, I thought it was a mannequin or some kind of old prop. But as I looked closer, the shape of the bundle became unmistakably human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't a doll. It wasn't a prop. It was a body. The figure was so still I couldn't even tell if it had been placed there recently or if it had been there for years. The skin was pale, almost waxy, and the hair, though long and dark, was matted and tangled. It was clear that whoever this person had been, they had been dead for a long time. I recoiled in shock, my heart hammering in my chest as the full weight of what I had found began to sink in. How had no one ever found this before? I immediately regretted opening the trunk, but I couldn't look away. I needed to know more. As I cautiously reached for the bundle, my fingers trembling, I noticed something strange. A small, leather-bound journal lay at the bottom of the trunk, partially buried beneath the blanket. My curiosity won over my fear, and I pulled it out. The journal was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the handwriting inside was still legible. I opened to the first page, hoping for some answers. The entries were dated years ago, and the writing was frantic. The first few pages seemed to describe the author's fear of someone or something following them. The handwriting grew more erratic with each entry, and as I read, the story became clear. The author was writing about someone who had gone missing in our town many years ago. The name, though written in faint ink, was unmistakable. It was the name of a local woman who had disappeared without a trace when I was just a child. Her disappearance had never been solved, and people had long since stopped talking about it, writing it off as an unsolved mystery. I flipped through the pages in a desperate attempt to make sense of what I was reading. The journal described how the woman had been hiding from someone who was determined to find her. It seemed like she had tried to escape to the attic, possibly thinking it was the safest place in the house. The last entry was the most chilling of all. It read, "They've found me. I have nowhere else to hide. If anyone ever finds this, tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I didn't want it to end this way." The journal fell from my hands, landing softly on the floor beside the trunk. My mind raced as the pieces of the puzzle started to click into place. The body in the trunk wasn't just any person, it was the woman from the journal. The one who had disappeared all those years ago. I had found her, hidden away in my own home. But how had she ended up here? Why had she been left in the trunk? And most importantly, who had put her there? I suddenly felt very exposed, like I was being watched. My pulse quickened as I looked around the attic, the shadows seeming to close in on me. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there and tell anyone what I had found. But as I stood up, the floor creaked beneath me, and I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. The sound wasn't my own. It was coming from below. Someone was in the house. I rushed to close the trunk, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave the attic with that secret, but I also couldn't stay up there forever. I had to tell someone, but I wasn't sure who I could trust. As I quietly backed toward the stairs, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway below. Someone had been waiting for me to find it. Story 15. I had been driving for hours, the monotony of the open road only broken by the occasional stretch of farmland and small towns. It was meant to be a quick road trip to clear my mind and enjoy the freedom of the open road. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the horizon when I noticed a small sign pointing to a neighborhood just off the highway. I wasn't familiar with it, but it seemed like a peaceful place, so I decided to take the turn and explore. The road quickly became narrower, surrounded by dense trees on both sides. It was quiet, almost unnervingly so, and the houses that lined the street were old, their paint peeling and their lawns unkempt. But as I drove further into the neighborhood, the scenery seemed to shift, becoming strangely picturesque. The homes began to look well kept, the lawns manicured, and the air filled with the scent of freshly baked bread. I figured it was a quirky but charming little neighborhood, so I decided to stop and stretch my legs. I parked my car at the side of the road and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the cool air. People were outside, sitting on their porches or tending to their gardens, and they greeted me with warm smiles and waves. I smiled back, enjoying the simplicity of it all. After a few minutes, I struck up a conversation with an elderly woman sitting on her front porch. She seemed sweet enough, telling me about the neighborhood and offering advice on the best places to visit nearby. Her hospitality was almost too perfect, but I dismissed the thought as paranoia. As I was about to leave, heading back to my car, I noticed that the atmosphere had changed. The once friendly smile seemed a little too forced, the waves a little too rigid. When I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of discomfort settle over me. It wasn't just the looks they gave me, but something about the way the air around me felt heavier, like it was pressing in on me. I shrugged it off, thinking I was overthinking things, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I got back in my car and started the engine, ready to head back to the main road, but as I tried to drive away, I found that the street had changed. The road I had come from seemed to disappear behind me, swallowed up by a dense fog that had been there before. I tried to turn around, but every street I attempted to take led me in a circle, back to the same spot. Panic started to rise in my chest, and I turned the wheel frantically, desperate to break free. When I finally stopped, I noticed a group of people had gathered at the end of the street, watching me. At first, I thought they might be concerned, wondering if I needed help, but their expressions had shifted from curiosity to something darker. The smiles that had once been so welcoming now looked almost predatory. The woman on the porch I had spoken to earlier was now standing at the edge of the street, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity I couldn't quite understand. I rolled down my window, trying to ask for directions, but no one answered. Instead, they just stared, as if waiting for something. The silence was unbearable, thick with an unspoken tension that I couldn't escape. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I tried to start the car again, only to find that the engine sputtered and stalled. I was trapped. I looked around in a panic, searching for any sign of escape, but all I could see were the people slowly advancing toward me, their movements stiff and deliberate. My heart pounded as I slammed the steering wheel, trying to start the car once more, but it wouldn't budge. The fog had grown thicker, and now it felt as if the whole neighborhood was closing in on me. I had to get out, but there was nowhere to go. The woman I had spoken to earlier approached my car, her smile now gone, replaced by a stern, almost vacant look. She told me softly, but firmly, that it wasn't safe for me to leave. I thought I heard the word forever in her voice, though I couldn't be sure. My mind raced as I fumbled with the door handle, desperate to escape, but I found it locked, and my hands began to shake. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I had made a terrible mistake by turning into this place. The air seemed to thicken as more people gathered around my car. Some of them were holding objects, tools, knives, and strange symbols I didn't recognize. They weren't threatening, at least not yet, but there was an undeniable sense that they were all connected, part of something larger, something dark. I tried to open the door again, but it was stuck, as if the car itself was refusing to let me go. I turned my head, searching for any kind of help or escape, but all I saw were the people of the neighborhood, standing motionless, their eyes locked onto me. The fear I felt now was overwhelming. I realized that they weren't just ordinary people, they were a part of the neighborhood, the very fabric of it, and they didn't want me to leave. It was as if I had stumbled into something ancient, something far worse than I could comprehend. In a moment of sheer desperation, I unbuckled my seatbelt and tried to break the window with my elbow, but it wouldn't shatter. The people stood closer now, watching me struggle, their faces expressionless, their eyes empty. I could feel their presence closing in on me, and I knew that I had to do something, anything, to escape. But it was too late. The fog, the strange air, and the relentless people of the neighborhood had trapped me here. I wasn't going anywhere. As the darkness of the night settled in, I realized the truth. I had taken a wrong turn, and now I was stuck in a place where no one ever left. The neighborhood, with its smiling faces and warm greetings, was hiding something far worse, and it was now my prison, just as it had been for countless others before me. Story 16. After a long, exhausting day of work, I came home with the hope of a quiet evening to myself. The day had been draining, filled with back-to-back meetings and an endless stream of emails. As I entered my apartment, I immediately made my way to the bathroom to wash up, needing to shed the weight of the day. But as I stepped inside, I froze. The bathroom mirror was shattered. I blinked several times, unable to process what I was seeing. There was no way it had broken on its own. I hadn't been home all day. The glass was fractured into a web of sharp, jagged pieces, but that wasn't the most unsettling part. As I stepped closer, my stomach twisted. In the center of the shards, I could make out the faintest outline of a face. It wasn't mine. I recoiled in disbelief, my heart hammering in my chest. I leaned in, squinting through the broken reflection, trying to make sense of it. The face was distorted, its features partially obscured by the shards, but it was unmistakably there. The eyes stared back at me, dark and empty, with a coldness that sent a shiver down my spine. I felt a lump form in my throat. My own reflection should have been staring back at me, but instead, it was this strange, unfamiliar face. My breath came in shallow gasps as I stepped closer, instinctively reaching out to touch the mirror, but I pulled my hand back, as if afraid the face might reach out in return. The face in the glass didn't blink, didn't move. It was still locked in a silent stare that seemed to burrow into my soul. I looked at the pieces of the shattered mirror on the floor, trying to make sense of it. How had this happened? What was this? But there was no answer. Panic started to creep in as I backed away from the mirror. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them rational. Had someone broken in? Was there someone else in the apartment with me? The idea seemed absurd, yet the face in the mirror felt so real, so tangible. I quickly turned around, checking the rest of the bathroom. It was empty, as I expected, but that did little to quell the rising sense of dread. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That face staring at me from the broken mirror seemed to hold some kind of silent warning, a message I couldn't understand. I stepped out of the bathroom, my eyes glued to the cracked reflection for one last glance before I closed the door. My heart was racing as I stood in the hallway, the silence of the apartment amplifying the tension. The apartment felt different now, as if the air had thickened, weighed down by an unseen presence. I debated whether I should call someone, but who would believe me? How could I explain what I had just seen? It seemed impossible, but the image was burned into my mind. That face, those eyes were imprinted in my memory, more real than anything I had ever experienced. I tried to distract myself by going into the living room, but it didn't help. Every corner of the apartment seemed to be cloaked in shadows, the darkness pressing in from every side. I couldn't focus on anything. I kept thinking about the face in the mirror, wondering if it would show up again. Was it some kind of trick of the light? But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something more sinister, something intentional. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a broken mirror, a freak occurrence. But as the evening wore on, the unease only deepened. I couldn't bring myself to go back into the bathroom. I told myself it was irrational, that I was overreacting, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the hallway, the bathroom door standing like an ominous threshold. By the time night fell, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. The image of that face still lingered in my mind, as if it were watching me from the shadows. I felt a deep, gnawing fear that something was waiting for me in the dark. It wasn't just the mirror that disturbed me, it was the feeling that something was wrong with the space itself. The apartment that I had always felt comfortable in now felt foreign, unsettling. It was as if the very walls were closing in on me, trapping me in a place that no longer belonged to be. I grabbed my phone and tried to distract myself by scrolling through social media, hoping to calm my racing thoughts. But nothing helped. My mind kept returning to that face, to those empty, staring eyes. I had to know what was happening, had to understand why this was happening to me. The next day, I called a locksmith, thinking that maybe there had been a break-in. Perhaps the mirror had been shattered during some kind of robbery, though nothing appeared to be missing. The locksmith arrived, checked the locks, and reassured me that everything was secure. I felt foolish for even thinking such a thing, but it didn't explain what I had seen in the mirror. That night, I couldn't help myself. I went back into the bathroom, cautiously approaching the mirror, or what was left of it. The jagged pieces of glass still lay scattered across the floor. I knelt down, peering through the cracks. For a moment, I thought I saw something shift in the reflection, something moving just behind the broken glass. My pulse quickened, and I backed away, my legs trembling. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the shards of glass, waiting for anything to happen. But the bathroom remained silent. The reflection was still, empty, as though nothing had ever been there. Yet deep inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that the face was still there, watching me from somewhere beyond the broken glass. The mirror might have been shattered, but the horror it had shown me remained, a presence I couldn't escape. Story 17. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I hiked deeper into the woods. The path I followed was familiar to me. I'd walked it countless times before, drawn to the tranquility and isolation it offered. But today, something felt different. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, and a sense of unease clung to the edges of my thoughts. As I pushed forward, I veered off the main trail, eager to explore an area I hadn't visited in years. The dense trees and underbrush grew thicker, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded into a quiet hum. It wasn't long before I stumbled across something unexpected, a small clearing, tucked away behind a cluster of gnarled trees. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a grave. The earth around it was slightly disturbed, and there were no markers, no signs to indicate who lay buried beneath. Just a simple, unadorned patch of earth, slightly sunken in the ground. I stepped closer, curiosity getting the better of me. As I knelt down to inspect it, I noticed something that made my stomach churn, a small, weathered headstone, barely visible amidst the overgrowth. The stone was cracked, its surface worn by time. What caught my attention, though, was the name carved into it. My own name. The letters were faint but unmistakable. I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. I leaned in closer, hoping to make sense of it, but the words were clear: my name. A chill ran down my spine. I had no idea who could have placed this headstone here, and I didn't know anyone buried in these woods. The feeling of déjà vu washed over me, as though I had seen this grave before, but I couldn't place when or how. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but every thought only made it worse. It didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt deliberate, as though this grave was waiting for me. I glanced around the clearing, the feeling of being watched settling over me. The trees were tall and silent, their shadows stretching across the ground, and the air seemed to thicken with an unnatural weight. I felt an impulse to leave, to run back to the safety of the trail, but something held me there. I couldn't explain it. Some strange pull kept me rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the grave. I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. I sat down beside the grave, the unease in my stomach growing as I tried to understand what was happening. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above me, and for a moment, I thought I heard whispering voices. But when I turned around, no one was there. The sensation was fleeting, but it lingered in the back of my mind. Who could have carved my name into the stone? Why did it feel so familiar? As the shadows grew longer, the woods around me seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. I stood up abruptly, my legs trembling as I turned to leave. My eyes lingered on the headstone for just a moment longer, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw something flash in the corner of my vision, an image of myself standing at the grave. Only I was different somehow. The person in the vision looked like me, but their eyes were hollow, empty, and the expression on their face was one of deep sorrow. I shook my head, convinced I was imagining things, but the image wouldn't leave me. I hurried back toward the main trail, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. How could there be a grave with my name on it in the middle of the woods? Why did I feel like I had been there before? Like I was connected to that spot in some way I couldn't explain. The feeling of déjà vu grew stronger as I walked, but I couldn't make sense of it. The deeper I thought about it, the more impossible it seemed to shake the thought that I had been to that grave before, and that something about it had been waiting for me. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had almost completely set, casting long shadows across the path. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were clammy from the lingering fear. I didn't dare look back toward the woods, afraid that the grave would still be there, waiting for me to return. I tried to shake off the sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin, but it was no use. My mind kept going back to that headstone, that name, and the feeling of something watching me from the trees. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of the grave flashed in my mind, haunting me. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the name carved into the stone. My name. The connection between me and the grave seemed undeniable, like I was somehow meant to be there, like it was part of a story I couldn't remember but was meant to live out. The next day, I returned to the woods, determined to figure out what was going on. The clearing, the grave, and the eerie sensation were still fresh in my mind. But when I arrived at the spot where I had found the grave, I froze. The clearing was empty. There was no sign of the grave, no headstone, no disturbed earth. It was as if it had never been there at all. My heart raced and I searched the area frantically, but the grave was gone. I stood there in stunned silence, unable to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Had it all been some bizarre dream? The woods around me were still and quiet, but the questions remained. Why had I seen that grave? And why did it feel so familiar? I left the woods with more questions than answers, the haunting sense that something had shifted, something I couldn't explain. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the grave wasn't gone, that it was still out there, waiting for me to return. Story 18. I had agreed to babysit my niece for the evening while my sister and her husband went out for a much-needed date night. It was a quiet night, nothing unusual. I had settled in on the couch with a book, and my niece Emma was playing quietly in the living room. She was always a calm child, preferring to read or play with her dolls rather than run around and make noise. But tonight, there was something different about her. She kept glancing over at the corner of the room, her eyes wide and alert, as though she was watching something invisible. "Are you okay, sweetie?" I asked, putting my book down. She didn't answer right away, just stared into the empty space beside the bookshelf. I followed her gaze but saw nothing unusual. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of the lamp, and the house felt perfectly still. I tried to brush it off, thinking she was just tired, but then she spoke in a soft, trembling voice. "There's someone in the room with us," she whispered, her small voice barely audible. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't want to make her more frightened than she already was. "What do you mean, honey?" I asked gently, trying to sound calm. She pointed at the corner again, her little finger trembling. Right there. They're standing there. I glanced over at the corner where she was pointing but saw nothing. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just her imagination, but the unease in my chest was growing. I stood up, my mind racing with thoughts of what might be happening. "Emma, sweetie, let's go check the hallway," I said, trying to change the subject. "Maybe it's just the light playing tricks." She nodded but didn't move, still staring at the same spot in the room. I stepped toward the hallway, the floor creaking beneath my feet, and I felt a sudden unease settle over me. The house was old, and sometimes the creaking noises made me jump, but tonight it felt different, like the house itself was holding its breath. I reached the hallway and glanced down the corridor, half expecting to see something out of place. That's when I noticed the door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. It hadn't been opened before. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The door led to the attic, a place I never liked to visit. It was always cold up there, and there were strange, old things stored away in boxes, things that had been forgotten long ago. My heart began to race, and I took a hesitant step forward, wondering if I should investigate further. I glanced back at Emma, who was now standing in the doorway of the living room, her wide eyes fixed on the hallway. She didn't move, but her gaze followed me, and I could see a faint tremble in her hands. "I don't like it," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but the fear in her eyes was unmistakable. My first instinct was to tell her it was nothing, that there was no reason to be afraid, but a part of me felt like something wasn't right. I walked slowly toward the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps, trying to calm myself. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. I reached the attic door and hesitated for a moment, staring at the gap in the doorframe. The faintest sound reached my ears, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was the sound of children's laughter. I froze, my blood running cold. The laughter wasn't coming from Emma, but from somewhere higher up. The attic. My heart hammered in my chest, and my mind began to race. Who could be up there? I didn't know any children who lived in the house. There was no one else in the family, no friends or relatives with children who might have access to the attic. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself that it was probably just the house making strange noises. But the laughter was too clear, too real to ignore. I turned to look at Emma, who was still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with terror. "Emma," I said, my voice shaking slightly, "go wait in the living room, okay? I'll be right back." She didn't argue, and without a word, she turned and hurried back to the living room, though she kept glancing back at me with that same frightened expression. I couldn't blame her. I didn't want to go into that attic, but the sound of the laughter was growing louder, more distinct, and I couldn't just leave it unanswered. I had to know what was causing it. With a trembling hand, I slowly pushed the door open. The creaking of the hinges echoed through the hallway, and I stepped inside. The air was cold, the familiar scent of dust and old wood filling my nostrils. The staircase to the attic was steep and narrow, and the darkness at the top seemed to swallow up the light from the hallway. I swallowed hard, my heart racing in my chest. As I climbed the stairs, the laughter grew fainter, but it still lingered in the air, a sound that sent a chill down my spine. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated. The attic was pitch black, but I knew I couldn't just leave it unexplored. I found the light switch and flicked it on, the harsh light flickering for a moment before illuminating the space. The attic was empty, save for a few old boxes and some furniture draped in dusty sheets. But something was wrong. The laughter had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me. I turned in a slow circle, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. There was no one up here. No children, no explanation. I slowly backed down the stairs, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Had it all been my imagination, or was there something I wasn't seeing? I didn't know. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs and turned to close the attic door, I heard one final laugh. A soft giggle that sounded like it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, but the attic was still empty. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. Something or someone was waiting. Story 19. I had rented a car for a weekend trip, something simple to get away from the grind of daily life. The drive was supposed to be peaceful, a short escape from the city, a chance to clear my mind. I picked up the car early in the morning, its sleek exterior gleaming under the harsh sun. It was a new model, equipped with all the modern comforts, and I was looking forward to a quiet ride through the countryside. At first, everything was fine. The car's GPS guided me down the highway, its voice calm and reassuring. I passed by rolling fields, small towns, and endless stretches of trees. The kind of scenery you only see in movies or in pictures from far-off places. I opened the windows, letting the wind rush in, feeling a sense of freedom that had been absent from my life for months. But then, without warning, the car began to steer off the main road. I didn't touch the wheel, yet it slowly veered onto a smaller, darker road. My initial thought was that it was just a mistake, maybe a recalculation of the GPS route. I grabbed the steering wheel and tried to turn it back onto the highway, but the car resisted. It kept pulling me deeper into the forest, down a winding road I had never seen before. I glanced at the GPS, but it wasn't showing anything familiar. The map was blank, the roads I was traveling on not even appearing. The darkness of the trees pressed in on me from all sides, and a chill ran down my spine. The further I went, the more unsettled I felt. It was as though the car was leading me somewhere, but I couldn't understand why or where it was taking me. As I drove deeper into the woods, the car's headlights flickered, casting strange shadows along the narrow road. The further I went, the quieter everything seemed. No birds chirped, no animals rustled in the underbrush, just the soft hum of the engine and the distant rustling of leaves. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that maybe this was some kind of glitch with the GPS or the car's system, but the unsettling feeling that something was wrong lingered. I pulled over to the side of the road, hoping to regain control. Turning off the engine, I thought that if I restarted the car, it would fix whatever malfunction had caused it to go off track. But as I turned the key, the lights stayed on. The engine was off, but the car remained illuminated, as if it were still running. A tight knot formed in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I stared at the dashboard, my fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. The silence around me was deafening. I felt the weight of the darkness closing in, as if the night was pressing against the glass, wanting to pull me into it. Then, just as I was about to open the door and get out, I heard it. A faint whisper coming from the back seat. At first it was so soft I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. The voice was low and almost melodic, a soft murmur I couldn't quite make out. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. The back seat was empty. The car was still. No one was there, but the voice continued. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I could feel its presence, like a pressure in the air. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I quickly turned back to face the road. My hands shook as I clutched the steering wheel, desperately trying to stay calm. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had been alone for too long and the silence was playing tricks on me. But then the whispering came again, closer this time, as though it were coming from right behind me. I could hear the words, now faint but unmistakable, come closer. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The urge to flee, to drive away as fast as possible, was overwhelming, but I couldn't. It was as if the car was trapping me here, in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, the car jolted forward, moving on its own. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, and I tried desperately to regain control. The car was no longer responding to my commands, driving itself deeper into the woods. I glanced at the GPS again, but it still showed nothing, just a blank screen. My mind raced with questions. Who had been in the back seat? What did they want? Why was the car doing this? The road ahead twisted and turned, and the car seemed to follow an unspoken path, guiding me further away from civilization. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. The trees on either side of the road loomed like dark, silent watchers. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if something was trying to communicate, but I couldn't understand what it wanted. The car slowed as it approached a clearing. There, in the center of the woods, stood an old, decaying house, its windows dark and lifeless. The car stopped in front of it, the engine finally going silent, though the lights remained on. I didn't know why, but I knew I had to get out of the car. I had to see what was inside. Something was pulling me toward the house, a force stronger than my fear, urging me to go. I opened the door and stepped out, my feet sinking into the damp earth beneath me. The moment I left the car, the whispering stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The house loomed in front of me, its broken windows like empty eyes watching my every move. As I walked toward the house, I turned back to the car. The headlights flickered once, then went out. The car was dark, lifeless, as if it had never been anything more than an ordinary vehicle. But I knew what I had heard, what had happened. The car was more than just a machine. It had been a vessel, leading me here to this place where it was waiting for me to discover the truth. I took a deep breath, stepping closer to the house. The door creaked open by itself, as if inviting me inside, and I knew in that moment that my journey had only just begun. Story 20. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when the call came in. It was a blocked number, the kind that made my gut tighten instinctively. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the phone, my thumb hesitating over the screen as I said, "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, then a voice, a low, guttural whisper that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm inside your house." My heart skipped a beat, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I froze, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. It couldn't be real. My house was secure, I was alone, and no one should have known I was home. I scrambled to gather my thoughts, trying to convince myself it was some kind of prank. I was alone, and the house was supposed to be safe. The walls felt suddenly too close, the air too thick, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a moment, only to hear faint breathing on the other side. Whoever it was, they weren't hanging up, and that made my skin crawl. I stood up, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and walked toward the front door. I checked the locks, turned the handle, and found it secure. There was no way someone could have slipped in. I moved to the windows next, peering out through the curtains, but everything looked quiet. My neighborhood was always peaceful, and I couldn't see any sign of intrusion. But still, the voice echoed in my head. "I'm inside your house." I couldn't shake it. Panic started to settle in as I moved through the house, checking every room. I opened each door cautiously, making sure nothing was out of place. The kitchen, the living room, even the bathrooms all locked, all secure. But the unease in my stomach grew with every step. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something I was missing. I checked my phone again, but the call had ended, leaving no trace but a lingering sense of dread. I made my way upstairs, the silence of the house suffocating. Every step on the stairs creaked, and it felt like the house itself was watching me. I peered into each room, checking the closets, under the beds, behind the curtains, anything that could possibly hide someone. But there was nothing. No one. The house was still empty, or so it seemed. My breathing was shallow now, and my thoughts were spinning. Had I imagined the voice? Could it have been someone outside playing a cruel joke on me? I walked into my bedroom, where I had left my phone charging, and my heart nearly stopped. On the nightstand, next to the phone, was a piece of paper. It wasn't there before. I stared at it for a moment, my breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was neat, too neat. You should have checked the attic. I felt my legs go weak. The attic. I hadn't even thought of the attic. It was a small, seldom used space at the top of the house, hidden away behind a creaky door in the hallway. I could feel my pulse racing as I turned slowly toward the hallway. The air around me seemed colder now, and the silence was deafening. The attic door was slightly ajar. It had never been opened before. I swallowed hard and walked toward it, every step feeling heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, and I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to leave the house, to do anything but open that door. But I couldn't. My curiosity, my fear, drove me to push the door open. The staircase to the attic creaked as I stepped inside. The small light bulb above flickered erratically, casting long shadows along the wooden steps. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. I paused at the top of the stairs, looking around the dark space. It was small, filled with old boxes and forgotten furniture, but it didn't look like anyone had been there recently. I slowly made my way across the room, trying to steady my breath. The attic was cramped, with barely enough room to move around without bumping into something. There was no sign of anyone, no evidence that someone had been hiding in the shadows. But the unsettling feeling remained, like I wasn't alone, like someone was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I slowly turned toward the corner of the room, where a large, dusty mirror stood against the wall. For a moment, everything seemed still, too still. I moved closer to the mirror, my reflection staring back at me in the dim light. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, just a glimpse, moving behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I blinked, looking again, but the attic was empty. I was alone, or at least that's what I told myself. But as I started to leave the attic, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. My breath caught in my throat as I turned around, my mind screaming that I had to get out of there. I ran down the stairs, my pulse pounding in my ears, but when I reached the bottom, I froze. The front door was wide open, and outside, standing on the porch, was a figure, just standing there, watching me. My phone rang again. Another blocked number, but this time I didn't answer. Story 21. I was sitting in my bedroom, phone pressed to my ear as I chatted with a friend. The conversation was light, a distraction from the quiet evening. We were discussing everything and nothing at all when suddenly, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The noise was sharp and violent, like something heavy had been thrown against a wall. For a moment, I thought maybe it was just a dropped book or a piece of furniture shifting, but the intensity of the sound made it impossible to ignore. I quickly ended the call and set the phone down on my desk, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to go check, but a deep sense of unease settled in my chest. Still, I couldn't stay upstairs any longer, my curiosity getting the best of me. I grabbed a flashlight from my drawer, just in case the power had gone out in the chaos, and stepped out into the hallway. The house felt unnervingly silent as I crept down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking underfoot. My breath quickened as I reached the bottom, and I hesitated before turning the corner into the living room. The moment I entered the room, I saw it. A large window on the far side of the room was shattered, its jagged edges glinting in the dim light. Glass was scattered across the floor, and I could feel a chill in the air, as if the room had suddenly become much colder. But what caught my attention more than the broken window was the stillness of the room. No signs of anyone being there. No one had come through the broken window. No intruder, no sign of forced entry. It was as if the room had been untouched, except for the shattered glass. I stepped forward cautiously, the crunch of broken glass beneath my shoes sending a jolt of tension through me. My mind raced to explain what had happened. Was there a storm? Had something fallen outside to cause the window to break? But none of those explanations seemed to make sense. I walked closer to the window, my breath fogging up the cool air inside. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I squinted into the darkness outside, I could make out a shape, a figure. It was standing just beyond the broken window, almost too still to be human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figure was watching me. The shape was obscured by the darkness of the yard, but I could see enough to know it wasn't a person I recognized. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a deep sense of dread washing over me. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch at the broken glass or the sound of my footsteps. It just stood there, staring. The more I looked, the more I could see it wasn't just standing there. Casually, it was almost waiting. I took a hesitant step back, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I pointed it toward the window. The beam of light reflected off the shattered glass, but it didn't seem to reach the figure standing just outside. There was something wrong about it. The way it stood motionless, the unnatural stillness of its posture, made me feel like I was staring at a mannequin rather than a person. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for the right moment to act. I forced myself to look away, my pulse quickening as I backed into the room. What should I do? Should I call someone? My mind was a blur of panic as I turned to rush back up the stairs to grab my phone. But the thought of leaving the room made me feel exposed. I couldn't risk turning my back on whatever that thing was. I stood frozen, weighing my options. Should I confront it, call for help, or just run? In the silence of the room, I thought I heard something, a faint scraping sound. It was so soft I almost missed it, but then it came again. A dragging noise, like something scraping across the floor. I turned toward the window again, the flashlight now aimed directly at the yard, but the figure was gone. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of it. Had I imagined it? No, I had seen it, standing there, just outside the window. But now the yard was empty. I stepped closer to the window, leaning forward to peer outside, trying to catch any sign of movement. Nothing. The night was still, and the only sound I could hear was my own rapid breathing. But then I heard it again. The scraping noise. It was coming from the direction of the window, but this time it was closer. I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine as I realized the sound was coming from inside the house, not outside. My eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I spun around, panic setting in as I heard the noise again, now unmistakably coming from behind me. My flashlight beam swung wildly across the room, but it revealed nothing. I couldn't see anything moving, yet I knew something was there. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft scrape, almost like fingernails dragging across the floor. I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck, and I spun around, my breath catching in my throat. I was staring directly into the eyes of the figure, its face now pressed up against the window, its features distorted by the jagged shards of glass. It was smiling, or at least trying to smile, but the grin was twisted and unnatural. The figure didn't move, but its gaze never left me. And for the first time I realized it wasn't waiting for the right moment, it was waiting for me to move. Story 22. I had always dreamed of owning an old house, one with character and history. So when I found the perfect one, I jumped at the chance. The house was over a century old, filled with charm, but in desperate need of renovation. As I worked through the rooms, stripping away layers of paint and wallpaper, I began to uncover hidden details, things like original hardwood floors beneath the ugly carpet, and faded wallpapers that told stories of decades past. But one evening, while working in the basement, I discovered something I hadn't expected, a hidden door behind a stack of old boxes. At first, I thought it was just part of the house's quirks, maybe an old closet or storage space. The door was narrow and old, its wood warped with age and covered in layers of dust. I stood in front of it for a moment, debating whether to open it. There was something about it that felt off, like it didn't belong with the rest of the house. But curiosity got the better of me, and I grabbed a crowbar to pry the door open, the hinges creaking in protest as I forced it ajar. What lay beyond was unexpected, a narrow, dimly lit tunnel that stretched into darkness. The air that rushed out from the tunnel was cold, musty, and thick with the scent of mildew. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. Why would there be a tunnel under the house? And where did it lead? I debated whether to go down there, but something pulled me toward it, a strange mix of fear and fascination. I stepped cautiously into the tunnel, the narrow walls closing in around me as I took each step carefully. The floor was uneven, covered in dirt and small rocks. As I moved deeper into the passage, I noticed how the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, and with each step I felt more and more isolated from the world above. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the narrow space, growing louder with each movement, until I stopped, realizing I was no longer hearing anything beyond the tunnel. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me from the shadows. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the longer I stood there, the more the sensation grew. The air grew thick with tension, and I felt an overwhelming urge to turn back. But just as I was about to retrace my steps, I heard something, a low, almost imperceptible sound that made my blood run cold. It was a scraping sound, like something shifting in the darkness, and it was coming from further down the tunnel. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen, trying to determine what it was. The noise stopped, and for a moment, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a soft thud that echoed through the tunnel. My breath caught in my throat as I realized I wasn't alone down there. Someone was waiting for me. I turned quickly, desperate to get back to the safety of the basement. But as I took a step toward the entrance, I heard it again, a loud scrape, followed by another thud, closer this time. I whipped around, my eyes searching the darkness for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The tunnel remained as still and silent as ever, yet I could feel its presence, the weight of something ancient and malignant in the air. My pulse raced as I began to back away, my feet stumbling over the uneven ground. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but when I finally turned to leave, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the darkness swallowing any trace of light. It was as if the passage was trying to keep me there, to draw me deeper into its grasp. My breath quickened, and I felt my chest tighten as I stumbled back toward the entrance. The scraping sounds followed me, growing louder and faster with every step I took. Finally, I reached the door and pulled it open, nearly falling as I scrambled to get back into the basement. I slammed the door behind me, my heart pounding in my ears. I stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. I was safe for the moment, but the feeling that something was still down there waiting lingered in my mind. I knew I couldn't ignore what I had found. I had to know what was down there, but at the same time I was terrified of what I might discover. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the tunnel. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow connected to the house's strange history. It was almost as if the house had been hiding something that had been locked away for years. The more I thought about it, the more the sensation of being watched returned. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, seemed to echo through the tunnel, reminding me that whatever I had felt down there was still there, lurking just out of sight. I decided to return to the tunnel the following weekend, determined to uncover the truth. Armed with a flashlight, I approached the door again, my hands trembling as I unlocked it. The air in the basement felt heavier than before, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to open the door. I pushed it open slowly, the familiar scent of mildew and earth flooding my senses as I stepped back into the tunnel. This time I was more prepared. I moved through the passage cautiously, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The scraping sounds didn't come this time, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I reached the end of the tunnel, where I found a small, sealed door, barely visible in the dim light. My heart skipped a beat as I touched the cold metal handle, and I realized that whatever lay beyond was something the house had kept hidden for a reason. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity pushed me forward. I turned the handle, and as the door creaked open, I saw something that made me wish I had never discovered the tunnel at all. Story 23. The sound of the loud music blasted through the thin walls of my apartment, reverberating in my ears like a persistent drumbeat. It had been going on for hours, and I could feel my patience wearing thin. The bass was so strong that I could feel it vibrating in my chest, making it hard to concentrate on anything. I had already tried to drown it out by putting on my own music, but nothing seemed to work. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would stop, but it didn't. The music just got louder, the notes piercing through the walls and filling every corner of my apartment. I could hear the thumping rhythm of the bass, and even the words of the song, clear as day. I wasn't sure how anyone could stand it, let alone enjoy it at such an unbearable volume. By this point, I was becoming increasingly frustrated. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, determined to have a word with my neighbor. I had lived in this apartment complex long enough to know where their unit was, just 2 doors down from mine. I figured a simple knock on the door would do the trick. Surely they didn't realize how loud it was, and once they knew, they would turn it down. As I approached their door, the music grew even louder. It was almost as if the stereo was trying to overpower my every step. I knocked once, then again, louder this time, hoping someone would hear me over the blaring noise. I waited, listening for any sound that might suggest someone was inside, but there was nothing. No movement, no response, just the deafening music. Frustrated, I decided to try the door. Maybe they had left it unlocked. I turned the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. It wasn't locked. My heart began to race as I stepped inside, already expecting to find a place full of people, maybe a party, or at least someone who could turn down the music. But the apartment was eerily quiet, save for the blaring stereo. The room was dimly lit, with the lights still on, but there was no sign of anyone. The furniture was neatly arranged, the kitchen was tidy, and there was no trace of life. I stood there for a moment, confused. How could the stereo still be playing, so loud and clear, yet no one was home? I looked around, trying to make sense of the situation. It didn't make any sense. I walked further into the apartment, my footsteps muted on the carpet. The music continued to play, the speakers seeming to echo through the otherwise empty space. I made my way toward the living room where the stereo was positioned. It was a large, expensive-looking system with speakers that must have been capable of filling an entire house with sound. The volume was cranked up to the maximum, the bass thumping in time with my own pulse. The strange part was that everything seemed perfectly normal, except for one glaring detail: there was no one here. I glanced at the windows, hoping to see a car in the parking lot or some sign that someone had recently left. But the parking lot was empty, and the blinds were drawn tight. There was no indication that anyone had come or gone. It was as if they had just vanished into thin air. I moved closer to the stereo, trying to figure out how to turn it off. I found the remote on the coffee table, but when I pressed the button to lower the volume, nothing happened. I tried again, then again, pressing every button I could think of, but the music continued to blare at full force. I started to feel a sense of dread creeping up my spine. How could the stereo be playing, and yet there was no one around to control it? I decided to investigate further. I opened the door to the bedroom, hoping to find some clue about where my neighbor might have gone. The room was as neat as the rest of the apartment, with a neatly made bed and a few personal items scattered around. Nothing seemed out of place, but the longer I stood there, the more unsettling the situation became. It felt like I had stepped into some kind of weird limbo, where time had stopped, and I was the only one left to witness it. I glanced back at the stereo, still blaring away, its volume unchecked. The lights flickered slightly, and I had the strange sensation that something was off. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no rational explanation for what was happening, but everything in me screamed that I shouldn't be here. I had come to ask a simple favor, to get them to turn down the music, but now I was in an empty apartment with an overwhelming sense that something was wrong. I left the bedroom and walked toward the front door, feeling an increasing sense of urgency. The stereo continued to play, the same song repeating over and over again, as if mocking me. I reached for the door, my hand trembling, but just before I left, I heard a sound behind me. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. A faint rustling noise, like someone moving in the other room. I turned around, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there, but the air felt thick, charged with an unnatural presence. I quickly stepped out of the apartment and closed the door behind me. As I stood in the hallway, listening to the music still playing, I realized that the apartment had been empty all along, empty, except for the stereo. I couldn't explain it, but something about that place, and the way the music continued to echo through the silence, made my skin crawl. I had never felt so alone, yet so watched in my entire life. Story 24. It was nearly midnight when I boarded the train, the soft hum of the wheels on the tracks offering little comfort against the eerie stillness of the station. The platform was almost deserted, and the dim lighting cast long shadows across the walls, making everything feel a little too quiet. I stepped onto the train, found an empty seat by the window, and settled in, hoping to get some rest before my long journey home. The carriage was mostly empty, save for a few scattered passengers, all of whom were lost in their own worlds. As the train began to move, I tried to relax, staring out the window at the blur of passing lights. But something felt off. Every time I glanced toward the seat across from me, I noticed a man sitting there. At first, he appeared to be a figment of my imagination, a shadow in the corner of my vision. But when I looked again, he was still there, sitting quietly, staring straight ahead, his face hidden in the shadows of the dimly lit carriage. I brushed it off as nothing more than the strange feeling you get when you're alone in a quiet place at night. Maybe it was the fatigue from a long day, or perhaps I was just imagining things. The man didn't seem to move, and I convinced myself that I was just being paranoid. Still, there was something about his presence that unsettled me. Every time I glanced in his direction, he was a little closer, as though he had slowly shifted forward without me noticing. At first, I told myself it was just the train's motion causing the illusion. The gentle rocking made everything feel disorienting, and I had been awake for hours. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to push the unsettling feeling away, but when I opened them again, the man was closer still. He hadn't moved from his seat, yet somehow his position seemed different. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that despite the dim lighting, his face was now visible. The man was older than I had first thought, his skin pale, almost sickly looking, with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were fixed ahead, but there was something unnatural about the way he held himself, as though he wasn't fully present. I felt a chill creep down my spine, and I tried to look away, pretending that everything was normal. But each time I glanced up, my eyes were drawn back to him. He hadn't moved, but he was closer, much closer than before. A sense of dread settled over me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt as if the man was watching me, waiting for something. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just my imagination running wild, fueled by the isolation of the late hour. But even as I tried to rationalize it, my heart began to race. The man hadn't spoken a word, hadn't made a sound, but he was there, undeniably there, in the seat across from me. And now there was no mistaking it, he was staring directly at me. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, my palms starting to sweat. The train rattled along the tracks, the rhythmic sound doing nothing to ease the tension building in the air. I considered getting up and moving to another carriage, but something held me in place, as if the man's presence had rooted me to the spot. My eyes flicked toward him again, and I felt my heart skip a beat. He wasn't sitting in the seat across from me anymore. He was sitting right next to me. I gasped, the sudden proximity of the man leaving me paralyzed with fear. His cold breath brushed against my skin, and I could feel the weight of his presence beside me. I wanted to scream, to jump up and run, but my body refused to move. The man sat there, motionless, as though he had been there all along, his gaze still fixed on me, unblinking and unrelenting. I tried to speak, to demand why he was there, but the words caught in my throat. My mouth was dry, my breath shallow, "Are you okay?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the noise of the train. But the man didn't respond. He simply tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into an unsettling smile that made my blood run cold. His smile didn't reach his eyes, which were dark and hollow, as if something was missing behind them. I wanted to look away, to escape his gaze, but I couldn't. It was as if his eyes were pulling me in, trapping me in place. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as the man's smile grew wider, more unsettling. I shifted again, but this time I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed the handle of the door, intending to get up and leave the carriage. But just as my hand touched the metal, I felt a sudden pressure on my arm. The man's cold fingers had wrapped around my wrist, holding me in place with a grip that felt like iron. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and raspy, almost a whisper. "You're not alone," he said, his words barely audible, yet they sent a shock through me. His grip tightened, and I could feel his breath on my neck, cold and heavy. Panic surged through me as I struggled to pull away, but the more I fought, the stronger his hold became. I looked around the carriage, desperate for anyone to notice what was happening, but the other passengers were all asleep, oblivious to the scene unfolding beside me. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. The train continued on its journey, oblivious to the terror I was experiencing. The man didn't let go. His grip tightened, his presence suffocating me as the minutes dragged on. I didn't know how long I sat there, trapped in the man's grasp, my body shaking with fear. Finally, just as I thought I couldn't take it any longer, the man released his hold on me. He stood up slowly, his dark eyes never leaving mine. Without a word, he moved back to the seat across from me, settling back into his place as though nothing had happened. I wanted to flee, to run out of the carriage and never look back, but my legs wouldn't move. As the train pulled into the next station, I bolted out of my seat, nearly knocking over a woman who had just entered the carriage. I didn't care. I ran, not looking back as the train continued on its journey, the man's empty seat staring at me from the darkness. I never took a late-night train again. Story 25. It was a quiet evening when I first discovered the voicemail. I had just returned home from a long day, the kind where the world feels distant and your mind is too tired to focus on anything. As I sat down on the couch and unlocked my phone, I noticed a missed call. I didn't recognize the number, but there was also a voicemail waiting for me. I clicked on it, curious but not expecting much, when the voice that came through the speaker caught me completely off guard. The message started with a soft, familiar sound, the sound of my own voice, speaking as if I were in mid-conversation. But something about it didn't sit right. It was late, almost midnight when the call had been made, and I didn't remember making any calls at that hour. The voice on the voicemail sounded calm, too calm for the way I felt in that moment, like it was someone else pretending to be me. As the message played on, I could hear the sound of my breath, and then, as if someone had stepped into the room with me, a faint shuffle of feet. I paused the voicemail, a chill creeping up my spine. What was happening? I was alone when I checked the message, yet the voice sounded as though it was in the same room, speaking right beside me. I hit play again, this time listening more carefully, but as soon as the voice began, I noticed something even stranger. Another voice, much quieter, seemed to be lingering just behind mine. I couldn't quite make out the words, but it was unmistakable, a second person's voice. Distant but distinct, almost as if they were whispering into the phone. I immediately thought of a prank, maybe from a friend, but it didn't feel like that at all. The tone was unsettling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The voicemail cut off abruptly, just as I was trying to make sense of the voices. There was a long pause, followed by a strange crackling sound, as if the call had been interrupted by static. For a moment I thought the voicemail had simply ended, but then, just as I was about to delete it, I heard something faint but clear whisper, distorted and chilling. It wasn't from the message I had already heard. It was different. The voice, barely audible, seemed to call my name. "Emily," it whispered, my name stretching and warping through the static. The voice was not my own. It was deep, almost guttural, as if it came from a place far beyond the phone speaker. I froze, my thumb hovering over the delete button. For a long moment I just sat there, listening to the empty silence that followed. The whispering voice was gone, but the air in the room felt thick, charged with something that wasn't there before. I replayed the voicemail over and over, trying to find an explanation, something that would ease the growing sense of dread that was settling deep in my chest. But each time, the same chilling sequence occurred. My voice followed by the other, and then the whisper, "Emily." I checked my phone's call history, but there was nothing, no record of the number that had called, no trace of the voicemail in my log. It was as if the message had appeared out of nowhere, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to hear it. As the night dragged on, I found myself unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whisper in my mind, the distorted, haunting sound of my name being called from somewhere deep within the phone, or perhaps from something much darker. The feeling of being watched crept up on me again, as though the very walls of my apartment were closing in. I thought about calling someone, asking if they had played some elaborate trick on me, but I knew that wasn't possible. No one else knew about the message, and even if they did, they couldn't have made that strange, distorted whispering sound. The next day, I decided to visit a friend, hoping some distance from the phone and the unsettling message would help clear my mind. But even as I left my apartment, the unease followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the whisper had followed me, that it was somehow tied to me. Every time I pulled out my phone, I found myself hesitating, as if waiting for the next message to appear. The longer I stayed away from home, the more the curiosity gnawed at me. By the time I returned, I couldn't stop myself from checking the voicemail again. I had convinced myself that it was just some strange glitch, something explainable. But when I opened the voicemail app, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a new message. I hadn't received a call, yet there it was, a voicemail with no number attached. The voice on the message was even more distorted than before, barely comprehensible, but unmistakably there. "Emily," the voice croaked, this time dragging my name out slowly. "Come, find me." The message ended there, leaving nothing but silence behind it. My heart raced as I stared at the screen. It was the same voice, no longer a whisper, but now it was almost like a plea. And there was something new, an invitation, a command even. The request to find me felt like a trap, one I couldn't ignore. I couldn't understand why, but deep down I knew I had to figure out what was happening. I checked my phone's settings, hoping for an explanation, but there was nothing. No recent activity, no apps that could have caused such a thing. It was as if the voicemail existed outside of time, outside of reality itself. My hands shook as I tried to delete the message, but the option wasn't there. The voicemail wouldn't vanish, no matter how many times I tried. The whispers, the voice, it was all becoming too much. The worst part, though, was the growing sense of inevitability. I knew I would have to follow the message's instructions. It was as if it was waiting for me to act, as if I were being pulled toward something, drawn into a story I didn't understand. But I couldn't stop myself. And in that moment, I knew that the voice wasn't just some glitch, it was real, and it was calling for me. Story 26. I was alone in the house one quiet afternoon, the kind where everything feels still, almost peaceful. The house was old, creaking in places where the floorboards had settled over the years, but it was a familiar sound. I was in the kitchen, making myself a cup of tea when I heard something that stopped me cold. It was soft at first, a faint sound of children laughing, distant but clear. I paused, the teacup still in my hand, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't have any children. In fact, I had never even had any guests with kids since I moved in. The laughter continued, rising in volume, echoing from upstairs. I glanced around the kitchen, as if expecting to find some sort of explanation, but there was nothing. The sound was coming from upstairs, unmistakably. Slowly, I set the cup down, my hands trembling slightly as I stood there, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. Maybe it was something from the neighbors, kids playing outside, or perhaps the wind carrying sound through the old walls. But no, the laughter was too clear, too real to be something trivial. I had to check. I made my way up the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, as if the house itself was protesting my intrusion. The laughter stopped abruptly the moment I reached the top of the stairs, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. My breath caught in my throat, and I slowly turned toward the hallway. There was no one there. The house was still, the air thick with an uncomfortable quiet. I checked each room, one by one, even opening the closet doors, looking behind furniture. Everything was exactly as I had left it, empty. There were no toys scattered on the floor, no signs of life at all. Still, my mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I stood in the hallway, my pulse quickening. The feeling of being watched was unmistakable, and yet I was alone. When I returned downstairs, I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. Maybe it was nothing, just the odd acoustics of the house, or my mind playing tricks on me after a long day. But that night, as I tried to sleep, the thought of those childish giggles lingered in the back of my mind. I kept hearing them, even when I closed my eyes. I couldn't shake the image of small figures moving just out of my sight. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, the events of the previous day weighing heavily on me. I told myself that I had imagined it, that I had simply let my imagination run wild in the silence of the house. But as I walked into the hallway, I stopped in my tracks. There on the wall was something I hadn't noticed before. Small, faded handprints were smeared across the surface, leading up the wall toward the attic door. My heart dropped into my stomach as I stared at the handprints. They were small, too small to belong to an adult, with fingers barely a few inches long. The marks were streaked, as though something had dragged its hands along the wall, and they didn't stop at the floor. They climbed higher, toward the attic. I had never noticed these marks before. They weren't there the day before. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was none. I walked closer to inspect the handprints, feeling an unsettling chill creep up my spine. They were old, as though they had been there for years, but they were unmistakably fresh. I reached out to touch the wall, my fingers brushing against the cool surface. As I did, a sudden cold breeze swept through the hallway, as if the house itself had exhaled. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart racing. I stared at the handprints, then glanced up at the attic door. The latch was closed, and the door was solid, just like it always had been. But now it seemed different. The air around it felt heavier, almost oppressive. I could feel the weight of something pressing down, something waiting. The attic had always been locked, and I had never given it much thought before. but now, with the handprints leading toward it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was up there. I hesitated, my breath caught in my throat. Part of me wanted to run, to ignore the strange marks and forget about it. But another part of me was drawn to it, as if some force was urging me to find out the truth. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and stood on it, reaching up to the attic door. With trembling hands, I unlatched the door and slowly pulled it open. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air as I peered into the darkness beyond. I switched on the attic light, my heart pounding in my chest as the small bulb flickered to life. The stairs creaked as I made my way up, each step slow and deliberate. The space above was cramped, filled with old furniture and boxes. But as I stepped into the attic, the silence felt suffocating. The air was thick, stale, and cold. There was no sign of anything unusual, no small figures, no laughter. But then, as I turned toward the far corner, I saw something. A small, dusty object lay on the floor, half hidden beneath an old blanket. I crouched down and uncovered it. It was a small toy, a doll, its face cracked and faded. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I stared at it, the same feeling of being watched creeping over me again. This was no coincidence. The laughter, the handprints, the toy, it was all connected. As I sat there, holding the doll, I felt something shift in the air around me. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the attic seemed darker, as if the shadows themselves were closing in. The laughter echoed again, louder this time, coming from somewhere deep within the house. It wasn't my imagination. There was something in the house, something I couldn't see but could feel all around me, and I wasn't alone. Story 27. I had been staying at my friend's house for a few days, enjoying the quiet and the escape from my usual routine. The house was old, with creaky floors and dimly lit hallways that gave it a sense of history. It was the kind of house that felt like it had secrets, quiet corners, and rooms that seemed to have been forgotten by time. I had spent most of my stay in the living room, or the guest bedroom, but one hallway always caught my attention. At the end of it, there was a door, old and worn, with a heavy lock bolted through it. I hadn't thought much of the door at first, but as the days passed, I found my curiosity growing. My friend had casually mentioned it when I asked about the strange hallway. "Don't open that door," they said with a laugh. "It's locked for a reason." The way they said it, though, was different. There was something in their voice, an edge of warning, that made me wonder what was behind it. I tried to let it go, but every time I passed by, I couldn't help but glance at the locked door. It nagged at me, like an itch I couldn't scratch. It wasn't until the third day of my visit that I finally made the decision. I had tried to forget about the door, but it was impossible. The mystery of it grew stronger each time I walked past. When my friend was out running errands, I found myself standing in front of the door once again, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the lock. I knew it was wrong to break their trust, to defy their warning, but something inside me urged me to find out what was behind it. I quickly found a small tool in the kitchen drawer and began working on the lock, my heart pounding in my chest. It was surprisingly easy to break, the bolt coming loose with little effort. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The air was stale, thick with dust, and the room was barely furnished, just a few shelves lining the walls. But it wasn't the furniture that caught my eye, it was the piles of letters scattered across the floor. The envelopes were yellowed with age, their edges curling and fraying. They were stacked haphazardly in piles, some open, some sealed. And what was most unsettling of all was the name on each one, my name. My pulse quickened, and I felt a wave of unease wash over me. I had to know more. I crouched down and picked up one of the letters. It was old, its paper brittle beneath my fingers. The handwriting was elegant, flowing, and it seemed to be addressed to me, though it was dated years ago. I turned the envelope over, my stomach twisting in knots. How could there be letters written to me when I had no memory of them? I began to sift through the piles, pulling out letter after letter, each one bearing my name. The dates on the envelopes were years apart, stretching back over a decade. Some of the letters were unopened, while others had been read and discarded, their contents faded with age. I opened one of the letters, my hands trembling. The message inside was written in the same elegant script, but the words were disjointed, as though the writer was struggling to convey something important. "I'm sorry," it began. "I didn't know how to tell you, but you need to know the truth." The rest of the letter was filled with cryptic sentences, half-finished thoughts, and words that seemed to make little sense. The more I read, the more unsettled I became. Who had written these letters? Why were they all addressed to me? And why had they been hidden away in this locked room? I picked up another letter, and then another, each one more confusing than the last. Some were long, detailing events I didn't remember, while others were short, with only a few lines of text. They all had one thing in common: they were written with a sense of urgency, as though the person writing them knew something I didn't, something I needed to understand. My head spun as I sifted through the letters, trying to make sense of them. The words seemed to echo in my mind, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember any of the events they described. As I looked around the room, I realized that I hadn't heard my friend come home. I quickly stuffed the letters back into their piles, trying to make the room look untouched. But the weight of what I had just discovered lingered in my chest. Who had been writing to me all these years, and why hadn't I ever received them? I closed the door quietly behind me, locking it once again, and tried to act as though nothing had happened. But the unease inside me only grew stronger, a gnawing feeling that I couldn't shake. Later that night, I tried to confront my friend. I asked about the letters, about the room, but they grew unusually quiet. "I told you not to open that door," they said, their voice low. "I should have known you wouldn't listen." There was something in their tone that made me pause, a mix of regret and something else, something darker. "You wouldn't understand," they added, turning away. I wanted to press further, to ask more questions, but something stopped me. The look in their eyes told me there was more to the story than they were willing to share. The letters in that room, those strange, decaying letters, were a piece of something I wasn't ready to face. But I couldn't forget what I had seen, the feeling of familiarity that had gripped me when I read those words. I didn't know who had written those letters, but deep down I knew that I was connected to them in a way I couldn't explain. The next morning, I left the house earlier than planned, unable to shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. As I walked away from my friend's house, the weight of the letters, the unanswered questions, and the locked door stayed with me. I would never know the full story, I realized. But something told me that, no matter how far I ran, the mystery of the locked room and the letters addressed to me would follow me.